Welcome to the Sleepy War Veteran. In this story, you will be taken in a beautiful documentary to take you on an adventure back into history. Please, calm your mind and enjoy the story. Before we're finished with this series, you'll hear the wartime accounting sheets that forced Germany to pivot away from the MG34, revealing the exact pressures from man-hours to field failures that made a weapon praised for perfection a liability under fire. And while you settle in, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing this history map itself across the globe. Now let's start with the amazing story. When German ordnance officers stamped MG34 on their forms in 1934, they were naming more than a machine gun. They were naming an idea that had crystallized out of 2 decades of frustration and learning. One gun to do every job an infantry commander could ask of automatic fire. In World War I, German units had wrestled heavy water-cooled weapons on sleds, then tried to lighten them for assault, then watched aircraft skim trenches while crews swung unwieldy barrels skyward with improvised sights. Between wars, the Reichswehr studied its scars and dreamed of a single pattern that could be carried by a squad, sustained on a tripod, and thrown onto a ring mount to rake the air. Einheitsmaschinengewehr, the universal machine gun, moved from concept to requirement. Versailles forbade Germany to possess what it wanted, but design is not a weapon until it is issued. In the 1920s, manufacturers hedged and improvised. Rheinmetall set up a Swiss front in Solothurn to keep hands busy. Mauser kept skilled men on peacetime projects that could transfer back to arms work in a heartbeat. Early stopgaps, MG08/15 conversions and the MG13, taught useful lessons about weight, feed, and heat, but no one pretended they were the future. The future would need a quick-change barrel, a compact locking system, a controllable trigger, and feed options that let the same receiver eat from a short assault belt or a long line of cartridges in defense. Trials drew on a small circle of firms whose names echoed across German industry. Rheinmetall and Mauser submitted designs that shared a family resemblance. Short recoil operation to keep the receiver compact. A rotating bolt to lock firmly at full pressure. Careful timing between feed, extraction, and firing so that a weapon cycling at high speed would not tear brass or stall on a stubborn case. The Ordnance Board wanted more than function. It wanted adaptability. A gun that worked only off a bipod would not do, nor would one that only earned its keep on a 4-man tripod. The winning pattern had to jump between roles by changing mounts and accessories, not the core mechanism. The weapon standardized in 1934 threaded those needles. The MG34's heart was a short recoil, locked breech action with a rotating bolt. When a round fired, barrel and bolt recoiled together a short distance. A cam path rotated the bolt, unlocking it so the barrel could halt, and the bolt continue rearward. The return spring drove the bolt forward again, stripping a fresh cartridge as the feed mechanism indexed the belt. The bolt's rotation gave strong primary extraction and a locked, rigid system for accuracy. For the gunner, the feel came through a 2-stage, double crescent trigger. Press the upper segment for single shots. Pull through the lower for automatic fire. This was not a gimmick. It gave a crew chief the choice to conserve ammunition or flood a lane without shifting grip or stance. Feed was as flexible as designers could make it. For movement, a 50-round Gurt Trommel assault drum clipped to the left side, protecting a short belt from mud while the squad advanced. For positions, non-disintegrating cloth or metal belts, issued in 50-round segments that could be joined, let crews sustain fire as long as barrels and ammunition held out. Starters with a stiffened tab made the first pull positive under stress. A top-mounted feed cover housed the pawls and springs, hinged so an armorer could clear debris or inspect parts quickly. On the right, a side-opening door released the hot barrel. With practice, an assistant gunner wearing an asbestos mitt could pull a glowing tube, insert a cool one, and have the gun back up in seconds. It was a ballet of routine learned on cold mornings at the range, and repeated until muscle memory made it dull, and just for that reason, reliable. Sights and mounts completed the transformation from a gun to a system. On its lightweight bipod, the MG34 crawled forward with a squad, the gunner lying behind the weapon, the assistant to his left feeding the belt and watching the change barrel schedule like a clock. Clamped to the Lafette 34 tripod, it became a different instrument. The traverse and elevation, T&E mechanism, allowed precise, repeatable lines of fire. An optical sight, commonly the Zielfenrohr 34, let a gunner walk grazing fire across a distant hedgerow with measured clicks rather than guesswork. A simple ring-and-post anti-aircraft sight could be fitted in minutes, and the same receiver dropped into armored vehicle mounts with a dedicated jacket variant. The gun did not ask the battlefield to conform to it. It adapted to the battlefield. Doctrine wrapped the mechanism in method. German infantry squads, the Gruppe, were built around their machine gun. Riflemen maneuvered to protect and supply it. The squad leader's art was not only to shoot, but to sight the gun where its beaten zone stitched the approaches an enemy had to use. Training hammered in fundamentals, select firm ground, set a low silhouette, map the lane of fire with landmarks, change barrels before accuracy drifted, feed belts with steady hands so the pawls did not fight a twist, keep oil thin in cold and scarce in dust. On the Lafette, crews learned to talk with neighboring guns, creating interlocking patterns of grazing and plunging fire that, on a map, looked like cross-hatched pencil and in a field sounded like a metronome. All of this demanded industry at scale. In the mid-1930s, German planners converted contracts into assembly lines. Mauser at Oberndorf, Rheinmetall-Borsig at Sömmerda, and Gustloff Werke took prime roles, with subcontractors cutting springs, stamping small brackets, and drilling gas shields. The receiver and bolt group soaked up mill time, dozens of precise operations, careful heat treatment, grinding, and inspection on jigs. Workers blued parts against corrosion. Armorers received collimating gauges to check headspace and inspect lugs. Barrels were rifled and proofed, then matched to guns in sets so field changes did not chase tolerances. Even packaging reflected the system's ambition. Transit chests carried spare barrels, mitts, oilers, brushes, gauges, belt starters, and, for tripod guns, the heavy Lafette and its optics. One gun filled a cart. The hidden cost announced itself here, long before the weapon saw dust or snow. Precision was expensive. Tighter fits made for accuracy and smooth recoil impulses. They also demanded clean shops, skilled machinists, and time, most painfully, time. As rearmament accelerated, production chiefs filed reports that mixed pride with warning. Scrap rates rose if cutters dulled or fixtures drifted out of true. Rework seats filled. A receiver that gleamed on a bench consumed hours that could have turned out two simpler housings for a different weapon. In peacetime, such costs are absorbed or deferred. In war, they metastasize into shortages. Field experience traced the other half of the price. In Poland and France, the MG34 seemed to validate every promise. Mobility on the bipod, precision on the tripod, and the psychological effect of a fast, flat burst that forced heads down at distances where opposing light guns lost control. These made a squad feel larger than it was. On armored vehicles, a variant with a different barrel jacket, optimized for tight mounts, fed coaxially beside main guns and in hull ball mounts. The system fit the doctrine fit the early campaigns. Then came climates that punished fine work. In North Africa, dust worked into the feed cover and turned oil to paste. On the Eastern Front, cold stiffened lubricants, and spring steel lost its snap in the wrong hands. None of this made the MG34 a bad gun. It exposed the tension between elegant tolerances and ugly conditions. Crews learned to strip covers, swab feedways, and keep belts clean. Armorers learned to carry extra extractors and springs. Manuals already cautioned against over-oiling and pressed frequent barrel changes. In the field, those cautions hardened into rules. A gun kept like a watch rewarded its crew. One treated like a shovel balked at the worst time. Commanders filed balanced reports that historians still read today. Superb firepower, sensitive to neglect, unbeatable on a tripod, demanding on a march. Behind the front, planners faced arithmetic. The Army wanted more guns than mills could produce at the pace of 1939 to 41. In response, engineers were told to apply Vereinfachung, simplification, and Rationalisierung, industrial rationalization, to the universal gun concept. The result, which belongs to our later chapters, would be the MG42, a receiver built from pressings and welds, a roller-locked bolt that tolerated looser fits, and a blistering cyclic rate that traded manners for sheer volume. But this was not an overnight replacement. The MG34 remained indispensable through the war. Its tripod accuracy, its compatibility with armored mounts, and the sheer numbers already issued kept it in the line from the first campaigns to the last defenses. Understanding the MG34's hidden cost means seeing beyond a price tag. It is the sum of machine hours, skilled hands, training time, spares hauled forward, and the risk that a fine mechanism meets coarse weather. It is the weight of a Lafette tripod on a horse cart, because the doctrine that makes sense at a map table demands it at a hedgerow. It is the barrel set in a chamois-lined sleeve, because accuracy only survives if heat does not twist steel. It is, above all, a choice, conscious and deliberate, to make a gun that could act as scalpel and hammer in one, and to pay what that choice required in factories, depots, and hours on the range. To see the weapon whole, we should walk through a day with a gun team as German manuals imagined it in the late 1930s. Before first light, the squad leader checks ground, firm enough for a bipod, with a shallow rise to hide a silhouette. The assistant gunner lays out the kit. Belts in tins, a drum clipped for the first rush, spare barrels within arm's reach, mitt to hand. The gunner rehearses the first burst in his head. Single shots to confirm zero if time allows, then a measured automatic string to stake a claim on the lane. When the order comes, the team moves, not as 3 men and a weapon, but as a single idea. Establish fire superiority, hold it, and let riflemen exploit. The first belt runs fast. The barrel swap is automatic. The second belt feeds while the squad shifts. If the position turns to defense, the Lafette tramp is worth it. The gun grows fangs, optics on, T&E clamped, and the lane turns into a problem for anyone approaching. Multiply that by scores of squads, and you have the doctrine that made German small units dangerous even when outnumbered. Now shift the lens to a factory floor. A receiver cut from steel bar takes passes on 3 machines. A bolt head's locking lugs are ground, checked on a gauge, polished, checked again. A feed cover spring is coiled, tempered, and tested in a jig that stamps an inspector's mark. One mistake ruins a day's work. One dull cutter turns a hole out of round and forces a part into scrap. A manager looks at his board. Barrels cued for rifling, receivers cued for heat treat, Lafette castings arriving from a subcontractor that has its own bottlenecks. He knows that each complete set is more than a number. It is a squad's centerpiece, and that his line's tempo will ripple outward to training calendars, shipping schedules, and ultimately to a field somewhere he will never see. Between those two scenes sits the Ordnance Office, where numbers and doctrine meet. There, in files we will open later in this series, ledger lines compare man-hours and stoppage reports. Memos weigh precision against output, and officers decide whether to push for a simplified sister without abandoning the firstborn. The MG34 is the measure used in those debates, the high mark of what a universal gun can be when accuracy and adaptability are the priority. The hard lesson in what it costs to keep that promise when the world is on fire. By the end of this chapter, you should feel the MG34 not as a museum piece on a stand, but as a system that pulled a squad, a factory, and a doctrine into one orbit. In the next chapter, we'll step closer to the bench. The patents and prototypes that fed into the 1934 pattern. How Rheinmetall, Mauser, and state arsenals carved their respective roles. Why the bolt rotates the way it does. And how the Lafette's clockwork lets a gunner write geometry in bullets. And as promised at the very start, we'll keep a quiet eye on the accounting ledgers that eventually forced a reckoning, because that reckoning, when it arrived, changed more than a part number. It changed the way Germany fought. As promised, we step closer to the bench, into drawing rooms and shop floors, where the universal machine gun moved from ambition to metal, and where the features you heard outlined in our opening chapter were argued, prototyped, and fixed into a pattern that armies could actually field. The requirement predated its name. After the First World War, German designers picked at the same knot from three directions: lighten the gun, speed the barrel change, and make feeding flexible enough that one receiver could live on a bipod with a short belt or on a tripod with a long one. Officially, such work did not exist. In practice, firms kept skill alive by routing projects through foreign subsidiaries and civilian fronts. One strand ran through Switzerland in the form of Solothurn, where German capital and German engineers could develop a family of recoil-operated guns without inviting Allied inspectors into German plants. Another remained at Oberndorf, where Mauser's peacetime commissions kept machine tools and craftsmen in practice, and a third at Rheinmetall's gun-making arm, where the core ideas that would become the MG34, short recoil operation, a rotating bolt head, quick barrel changes, were refined. The MG30, built at Steyr Solothurn and adopted in variants by Austria and Hungary, was a crucial stepping stone. It proved that a compact, short recoil, locked breech mechanism could run fast and clean with rifle ammunition, and it taught engineers how to time the dance between barrel, bolt, and feed without tearing brass or smearing rims. But it was not yet the one gun for all jobs the Reichswehr's thinkers wanted. It needed broader feed options, a faster, safer barrel swap, and a mount system that could jump from trench lip to prepared position without changing the receiver itself. The German ordnance requirement that matured in the early 1930s wrapped those lessons into a single specification and threw down the gauntlet. Build a gun that could serve as squad center of gravity on a light bipod, as sustained fire area weapon on a precision tripod, and as an anti-air stopgap, all without a second receiver model. That demand explains the two features veterans remembered in their hands for the rest of their lives: the rotating bolt and the double crescent trigger. The bolt head's lugs locked into the barrel extension as barrel and bolt recoiled together after each shot. Then a cam path forced the bolt to rotate and unlock. Strong primary extraction without the side-to-side wobble that looser systems tolerated. The rotation kept the moving mass tidy, the line of recoil straight, and the receiver compact enough to sit low to ground. The trigger, a single bow with two distinct faces, made control intuitive. Press the upper for single shots, pull through the lower for a measured burst. A squad leader watching ammunition and heat could ask for restraint or for volume, and the gun answered without a hand, leaving the pistol grip. Feeding was designed around flexibility rather than a single perfect solution. On the move, a 50-round belt sat protected in a clipped-on drum, so the first rush did not drag a naked belt through dirt. In position, non-disintegrating belts, issued in 50-round segments with starter tabs, could be linked up endlessly, letting a tripod-mounted gun write patterns in the air until the barrel schedule called a halt. The top cover, hinged on the right, housed a feed mechanism that advanced the belt half a step on the opening stroke and half on closing, steady, positive, and forgiving to the assistant gunner, so long as he fed straight and smooth. Field armorers liked that cover for another, quieter reason. It opened wide for inspection and cleaning, and it closed with a reassuring spring-tight click that told you, even with gloves on, that the Powells had seated. Heat management, often reduced to a single line in a manual, drove a dozen design choices. The barrel had to be rigid enough to shoot predictably when cool, thin enough to shed heat quickly, and secured by a latch that was both positive and fast. The right side door on the receiver let the assistant gunner pull a glowing tube with a mitt and seat a cool one in a handful of seconds. In doctrine, crews were taught to swap before accuracy drifted and long before cook-off lurked, hence the regular, almost ritual barrel change after a fixed number of rounds in sustained fire. In practice, that ritual was a relationship. The gun spoke through odor and color as much as through a clock, and experienced crews learned the tone their barrel took on when it was time. All of this precision lived on two very different platforms. On its light bipod, the MG34 was a sprinter, low, mobile, quick to point, suppressing an enemy position while the squad bounded. Folded and slung, it did not look much different from its predecessors. Unfolded and braced, it made a 9-man grouper feel larger than it was. On the Lafette tripod, the same receiver turned into a surveyor's instrument. The traverse and elevation mechanism, a box of gears, knobs and scales, let a gunner set a line of grazing fire to the click, then search it up a slope in fixed steps. With an optical sight mounted, a pair of well-sighted guns could stitch interlocking curtains over approaches a platoon leader had marked at noon with a grease pencil on a sector sketch. The Lafette weighed what it weighed, more than 20 kilograms with optics, and junior leaders grumbled when a march order put its carry poles on their squads. But when the fight turned to defense, that weight brought a kind of geometry that rifles could not imitate, repeatable, disciplined area fire that made ground itself feel hostile. Step back from the range a moment and watch the weapon being born. A receiver began life as a bar of steel, then spent hours under cutters and on grinders. Every slot, cam path, and rib served two masters, function and manufacturability, and the second master charged its own fee in time. The bolt head's lugs were milled and ground, then checked in gauges by inspectors who stamped tiny acceptance marks in places only armorers ever noticed. Feed covers came down lines that coiled spring steel to an exact temper and pressed pawls on jigs that guaranteed stroke length to fractions of a millimeter. Barrels were deep-hole drilled, rifled, proofed, then mated to receivers in matched sets so that a hot swap in the field would not chase headspace. Even the finish, deep blue on early production, was a process. Polish, degrease, salt bath, oil. Packaging revealed the system's true size. A complete gun set for a squad arrived as more than a receiver and a bipod. There were spare barrels and sleeves, an asbestos mitt and a brush, oilers and gauges, belt tins and starter tabs, a 50-round drum, and, if the gun was destined for sustained firework, the lafette and its optic with their own chests. In a quartermaster's book, that inventory took a page. In a wagon, it took space that could have carried something else. This is where the hidden cost lived long before ledgers ever compared the MG34 to its simplified successor. In hours on mills and grinders, in skilled hands that could not be trained overnight, and in cubic meters on trains that would never get cheaper. Doctrine made those costs feel justified. German infantry from the mid-1930s onward trained to a simple proposition. The machine gun is the squad's center. Riflemen are there to move it, sight it, protect it, feed it, and exploit what it buys. The manuals were dry, but the fieldcraft was not. Squad leaders looked for firm ground that gave a low silhouette and a clear beaten zone at knee height. Assistant gunners learned to lay belts so the feed cover pals did not fight a twist, and to think in strings, one short burst to announce the lane, a second to correct, then measured fire to hold heads down while the squad changed shape. In defense, crews practiced on the lafette with a clock and a notebook. Set bearings at landmarks. Register a stump at 600, a track at 850, a hedge at 1,000. Then practice the search. 3 clicks up, 3 clicks down. Until a gunner could walk fire by a number while a leader watched the ground. If you want to feel the system at human scale, spend a morning with a training company in 1937. The day begins in a shed that smells of oil and coal. On trestles, receivers are opened, feed covers propped to show powls bright with a faint film. Barrels lie in sleeves, each chalked with a number that matches a gun. A corporal walks a line of recruits, tapping a bolt face here, a locking lug there, asking questions whose answers are movements, not words. Strip, clean, oil sparingly, reassemble. Check that bolt unlocks cleanly by hand. Close the cover, feel the pawl spring bite. Out on the range, trenches are scratched into a slope that rises toward a stand of pines. The first strings are fired in single shots to confirm 0. The first barrel change is done at a stroll, then at a jog, then under a shouted time. By afternoon, the lafette is out, and the day's learning changes scale. The gunner does not aim so much as set, bearing, elevation, a pre-read number on the sight drum, and the bursts draw a horizontal seam where the platoon leader wants a knee-high hostility on an approach that by dusk no one would walk without a wince. Industry's side of the story moved just as quickly in those years. Contracts spread from the prime makers to a web of subcontractors cutting springs, stamping small parts, casting tripod components. As rearmament accelerated, the government imposed letter codes in place of factory names to conceal origin on receivers and optics. Acceptance marks multiplied. Behind every neat stamp was a chain of decisions. Add a machine here, shift a form in there. Teach a bench hand to read a new gauge. The first production years still looked like peacetime work. Then the orders steepened and the calendar ran faster. Field trials and early campaigns closed the loop between doctrine and design. In Poland and France, the MG34 became exactly what its advocates had promised: a mobile, precise fire source that let small units impose their will on ground. Veteran reports praised the controllable rate, the ease of shifting from single to burst, and the way the gun on a lafette could anchor a company front with geometry rather than guesswork. They also flagged the habits the gun demanded: keep belts clean, keep oil thin, change barrels before groups open. In North Africa and later in the East, the warnings hardened into rules. Dust punished tight fits by turning oil to abrasive paste if maintenance lagged. Cold thickened lubricants and stole the snap from springs if men used the wrong grades or too much of the right. None of this made the MG34 a failure. It made it a thoroughbred, brilliant with a good handler, exacting of care when weather was unkind. These experiences filtered into the quiet rooms where numbers were compared. Production managers did not write poetry. They sent tables, scrap losses when cutters dulled, hours per receiver, inspection bottlenecks, output shortfalls when a heat treat furnace went down. Quartermasters added their own arithmetic. How many wagons a fully equipped gun team consumed? How many tripods could be spared for an infantry regiment without starving heavy weapons companies? How often a barrel set needed replacement to keep accuracy inside doctrine. By 1941 to 42, those sheets began to suggest a second path, not to replace the universal gun idea, but to build a sister designed from the start for stamping and welding, with looser fits that tolerated dirt and cold better, and with fewer machining hours per receiver. That sister, the MG42, belongs to later chapters. What matters here is the hinge. The MG34 stayed, because it still did things the simpler gun would not do as well, especially on the Lafette and in vehicle mounts, and because hundreds of thousands already existed, but the ledger had planted a flag. The Lafette deserves one last look before we leave the bench for the field again, because it explains why the MG34's advocates fought so hard to keep it. Beneath the gunner's hands, a pair of screw jacks, gears, and a simple clutch let one man lay a lane to the minute of angle. A range drum, calibrated to ball ammunition, turned range into elevation without mental arithmetic. With 2 guns and a thin wire for a field telephone, a platoon commander could write a defensive diagram that a relief crew could pick up at midnight and execute in fog without ever seeing beyond the berm. In a war where movement often froze into small pieces of deliberate geometry that mattered. And it mattered especially with the MG34, whose smooth impulse and controllable cadence on the tripod made for clean, repeatable lines that rifle fire could never sustain. Before we close, return to the factory door and watch a finished set roll out. Receiver and bolt gleaming, feed cover spring tight, bipod folded, Lafette stowed, optics cased, spare barrels marked. It is expensive, not only in Reichsmarks, but in hours and hands. It is also the physical expression of a doctrine that gave the machine gun pride of place, asking it to be sprinter and metronome, scalpel and hammer. The price will matter when the war widens, and when the cold and dust of distant theaters test tight fits and careful finishes. The precision will matter every time a squad leader waves a hand, and a crew answers with a measured string that turns a path into a problem. In the next chapter, we'll take the MG34 out of sheds and drawing rooms and into the first campaigns, Poland, France, and the early months in the East, following gun teams through the routines of march, sight, fire, and move. Watching where the weapon earned its reputation and where it first showed the sensitivities that commanders would be writing home about by winter. Along the way, we'll keep an ear for those ledgers, because even as crews learned what the manuals forgot, someone in the rear was adding numbers that would, in time, force a choice. Dawn in September 1939 revealed what the weapon could do when doctrine, training, and terrain briefly lined up. Across the Polish frontier, company commanders put their machine gun groups exactly where interwar manuals had taught them to. On firm ground with a low silhouette, beaten zones set to knee height along lanes the enemy had to use. In the first days, the MG34 on its light bipod was a sprinter, keeping pace with rifle squads across plowed fields and sugar beet rows. The assistant gunner hugging the weapon's left side to feed a 50-round drum through the first rush, then snapping open the cover to take a long belt as the position firmed. Squads that had rehearsed barrel changes until they were boring changed barrels before the groups opened, and the gun answered with the same flat, controllable cadence it had on the range. Where the fight settled, ford crossings on the Bzura, the edges of cut wheat fields west of Warsaw, the Lafette tripod paid for every kilogram. Platoon leaders laid guns by click and landmark, a stump at 600 meters, the lip of a drainage ditch at 800, a track at 1,000. The traverse and elevation mechanism turned a strip of meadow into a ruled line no one walked comfortably. Polish units were not passive. Their Browning and Hotchkiss guns fought back. The country's light armor prodded at German flanks, and the counter-offensive on the Bzura cut into motor columns that had assumed the first weeks would be a parade. In those hours, the MG34's flexibility, bipod to tripod, drum to belt, held roads while higher headquarters pushed artillery forward and sorted the map. The campaign also taught two lessons that never left the gun. The first was ammunition. A weapon that could suppress at distance tempted gunners to spend heavily. Belts emptied quickly. 250-round boxes went light. Horses and trucks carrying Patronen-Kasten took a beating on poor roads. Company quartermasters learned to space their ammunition handoffs closer than the peacetime tables suggested. Squad leaders learned to demand single shots when a job required control rather than noise. The second was maintenance under march conditions. Dust and chaff blew into feed covers, turning oil to abrasive paste if men oiled like they were still at the depot. The units that stayed closest to the manual, oil sparingly, keep belts straight, swap barrels early, reported fewer stoppages. The ones that treated the gun like a shovel found its tight tolerances reluctant when patience and cloth ran short. In the West, the following spring, the same machine gun met a different ground. The fighting in the Low Countries and northern France moved quickly from canal lines to hedgerows and village edges. At Sedan, where engineers forced crossings under artillery and dive bomber cover, MG34 teams were among the first across footbridges and assault boats to establish suppressive fire on the far bank. In villages like Stone and along the Gamblu Gap, the gun on its bipod suppressed windows and garden walls while riflemen cleared. When the front rippled instead of rolled, Arras is the name German veterans recalled, British counterattacks pressed with heavy tanks that shrugged off rifle and machine gun fire. Here the MG34 did the job it could do. It was not an anti-tank weapon, but it stripped enemy infantry from behind armor, stitched smoke to hide withdrawals, and covered engineers bringing up shaped charges and 37mm guns to do work against steel the machine gun could not touch. The Lafette turned the retreat toward the Channel into a geometry problem. Company and battalion machine gun platoons laid interlocking curtains across road approaches to hold ground while columns detoured. At Dunkirk's perimeter, where open fields fell gently to drainage lines and canals cut the map into compartments, tripod-mounted guns set to grazing fire made approaches unkind at knee height. On the coast, anti-aircraft posts came into their own, ring and post sights fitted in minutes to mount a defensive arc against low, harrying aircraft. The MG34 was never an anti-aircraft solution in the way a dedicated 20mm was, but its presence on truck and half-track mounts gave columns a measure of reassurance on roads where the Luftwaffe could not be everywhere at once. If the infantry carried the MG34 in their hands, the armored forces built it into their hulls. Panzer crews used a variant adapted for tight mounts, the barrel jacket heavier, and fully shrouded, solenoid triggers for coaxial positions, firing through coaxial and hull apertures with the same cartridge and bolt principle. A tank's coaxial fire beat down anti-tank gun crews long enough for a main gun to work. The hull gun kept infantry at a distance in narrow streets. The common mechanism mattered for supply and training. Armorers could service both patterns with the same gauges and many of the same spares. Crews trained on one trigger learned the other without relearning the weapon's behavior. Inside the vehicles, the universal idea was literal. The same receiver family fed different roles. By the summer of 1941, the pattern of use was set well enough that company leaders could predict what the weapon would give and what it would ask in return. Then the front ran east, and the environment turned the screws. In the first weeks, across the Neman, around Smolensk, on the roads to Kiev, the MG34 confirmed its reputation again. Units moving on dust-hard tracks put their guns on the bipod as a matter of habit the moment a column slowed. Companies shook out into attack with machine gun lanes measured and marked by voice and hand before a first burst announced the map to both sides. Soviet infantry with DP light machine guns and Maxims fought stubbornly. The DP's pan magazine and lower rate of fire made it less fearsome in sustained suppression. The Maxim's water jacket let it live longer under deliberate fire. German platoons answered by bringing their Lafette-mounted guns up as quickly as roads allowed. On the tripod, with optics, the MG34's flat string at range cleared trenches for riflemen, and the accuracy crews had learned on the range translated directly to field behavior. The ground stole back what the weapon gained. Dust-clogged belts. Summer heat brought early barrel change intervals. Oil thickened in the wrong places when men used too much to compensate for grit. When the weather broke, autumn rain turned tracks to ropes of mud. Horse-drawn ammunition caught in hollows. The weight of a Lafette and boxes that had seemed worth every gram in June were cursed out loud in October. Crews adapted. Belt tins were kept closed to the last moment. Fabric covers appeared over feed covers. Barrels were wrapped in sleeves with more care for keeping mud out than for polish. In letters and reports, company commanders balanced praise. Keeps heads down at 800 where the DP struggles, with reminders that not every stoppage was a matter of luck. Habits saved guns. The payoff was visible in small things. A position held under a counterattack because a crew did not squeeze the last hot seconds from a barrel. A night relief that picked up a registered line on a Lafette and reopened it at dawn exactly where it had stood the night before. Cold finished what dust and mud had begun. In the winter of 1941-42, crews learned to swap oil for low-temperature grease, to keep recoil springs dry, and to free cycle bolts by hand before loading to feel for sluggish movement. Lubricants that worked at room temperature turned to glue at 20 below. A gun that had run like a sewing machine in France felt reluctant on the step at dawn if the night routine had been sloppy. German manuals caught up, addenda with cold weather notes on oils and clearances circulated. But the best lessons were local. A platoon sergeant who had learned by touch when a bolt was too slow taught it to new men the way he had learned, by putting a hand on the handle and moving it through its stroke until the difference between right and wrong lived in the palm more than in a paragraph. Even in winter, the Lafette remained the best argument for the weapon's place in a company. On frozen ground, with visibility low and branches heavy with snow, tripod-mounted guns set to measured bearings made avenues deadly by habit. A platoon that had lost half its veterans could still put a lane across a road at knee height by number if the sight picture had been rehearsed the day before and if the wire to the neighboring gun was still live. In those weeks, the MG34's controllable rate and smooth impulse mattered as much as its raw firepower. A gun that jumped or wandered under recoil would have stitched its bursts too high or too low to serve the geometry. The MG34, carefully sighted, kept to its line. The weapon's universal ambition extended beyond the squad and company to the column. Half-tracks bristled with pintle mounts, trucks carried improvised posts, and rear echelon depots issued ring sights with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for oilers and spare firing pins. The anti-aircraft role never seemed glamorous in memoirs, but it ate training time and brought its own arithmetic. A gun that was expected to swing skyward needed clear fields. Ammunition had to be apportioned, and someone had to decide whether a convoy would rather keep belts for the next ambush or spend them deterring a low pass. Through it all, the hidden costs multiplied quietly. Production managers sent up charts, hours per receiver trending higher when scrap rose, bottlenecks at heat treat, inspection jigs running at capacity, the optical sights for Lafettes arriving slower than the tripods themselves. Unit clerks logged issues of spare barrels and firing pins at a rate that suggested how hard the guns were being used at the front. Ammunition tables were amended. A company that had expected to use so many belts in a week used more. Supply officers reordered rail priorities accordingly. Training commands wrote back with separate reports. Live fire hours cut for recruits when ammunition allocations were diverted forward. Experienced non-commissioned officers demanded by depots to teach men how to keep guns running in mud and cold, instead of teaching them to set traverse lines on a range that looked nothing like the Dnieper's banks in November. The weapon's reputation stood intact precisely because those costs were paid. In the first years of the war, the MG34 in sure hands did what no rifle line could. It imposed a will on ground at 600, 800, 1,000 meters, either by precise, controlled bursts from the bipod or by deliberate, metronomic grazing fire from the tripod. It covered crossings, sealed lanes, stripped infantry from behind armor, and steadied retreats that might otherwise have become routes. The precise trigger that let a gunner choose between single and burst saved ammunition and bought barrels minutes of life. The quick change system turned heat from a crisis into a drill. Crews learned to carry the right oil for the temperature, to sleep with bolts under coats in deep cold, to pack belts so they fed straight even when a march had shaken tins upside down. At the same time, officers who read both battlefield returns and factory reports could see a hard truth forming. A machine gun as beautifully machined as this one, with its tight fits and time-hungry receiver, could not be manufactured in the numbers a continental war demanded without robbing time from other weapons. A gun that needed close maintenance to sing in desert dust or a Russian freeze could not be issued to hundreds of thousands of men and expected to be treated like an axe. The answer was not to pull the MG34 from units that knew its strengths. It was to ease the burden by fielding a sister that could be built faster and forgiven more. For the MG34, the early war had set the mold. It had shown how a universal machine gun could be the center of a squad and the spine of a company. It had written the geometry of defense across meadows and along canal banks. It had ridden in tanks and on half-tracks, swung at aircraft, and stitched curtains of fire in lanes commanders chose with a pencil and a glance. It had also, in dust and cold, and in the long arithmetic of factories and rail yards, revealed the price of such precision. By 1942, the weapon had settled into every corner of German order of battle, and the rhythm around it, factory, field, repair, had become a system. What had been proven in Poland and France was now routine across very different wars. A gun team that could sprint with a squad, and on the same day, anchor a company line with tripod geometry. The price of that routine, in men, hours, and steel, was now visible on two ledgers at once. One kept in depots and shops, the other written in the habits of crews who had learned how the gun behaved in climates that punished every tight tolerance it possessed. In North Africa, the MG34 showed both edges of its design. On hard pan and in wadis cut by flash floods, a bipod gun that lay low and fired flat strings across 600 meters was exactly what a platoon commander needed to cover a pullback or pin a ridge. Crews learned to keep belts inside tins until the instant they were needed, to wipe feed covers with a strip of cloth before every burst, to oil sparingly so dust could not turn grease into lapping compound. The first 50-round drum, clipped to the side to keep a belt clean while rushing to a fold of ground, made sense here in a way it rarely had in Europe. Once a position was firm, tins opened and long belts replaced the drum the way a practiced pair's hands replace a barrel. No drama, only sequence. The desert also made the weapons' sensitivities plain. Fine sand found the feed poles and the cam track on the bolt, where even a careful crew missed a line of grit. Armorers working out of canvas-topped workshops carried extractors and springs in small tins as if they were currency. The best ones learned to read the surface of a lug by sight and fingernail, hunting the beginnings of galling before it showed up as a stoppage in a fight. Commanders wrote measured reports home. Flawless firepower when kept clean, apt to sulk when marched dirty. Worth the wait when the tripod turned an open approach into a ruled line that made a patrol think twice about a late move. On the Eastern Front the same season, the terrain wrote a different script for the same gun. Summer heat and dust repeated the desert's lessons. Autumn mud punished every crew that had to carry a lafette and its optic through clay that held boots like glue. And winter cold forced a re-education in lubricants and patience. Crews learned to shake oil out of the routine and substitute thin grease that would not seize at dawn, to keep bolts dry enough to move without syrup, to cycle the action by hand before loading so sluggish steel announced itself before it mattered. Veteran sergeants taught new teams with their palms on the cocking handle, moving it through its stroke until right and wrong lived in muscle and not on a page. In towns, the gun's universal claim was tested in room and stairwells, where a tripod seemed a liability until dusk, and then became a gift. Urban fighting turned the bipod gun into a doorstop and a razor, set low behind a windowsill, cutting diagonals across a street, talking in clipped bursts that held the opposite stairwell, while grenades did the rest. At street corners, assistant gunners learned to feed belting by feel without showing their shoulders to the opening. Squad leaders learned to borrow a tripod from the company weapons platoon when a block had to be held through the night. The Lafette's traverse and elevation box, so precious on ranges and open slopes, made machine gun posts behave like furniture in a room. A lane set by number and alt angle could be handed off at midnight to a relief crew who could not see beyond a blown wall and yet pick it up without a round wasted. The integration with vehicles matured into habit rather than novelty. The armored vehicle variant, simplified for tight mounts and fired by buttons or linkages, lived coaxially beside main guns and in hull mouths. The fact that the same family of parts, tools, and gauges served both infantry and armor mattered when supply was thin or columns were sliding sideways through mud. A coaxial burst that shaved a trench line before a high-explosive shell arrived was as much part of a tank drill as a driver's gear change. A hull gun that kept infantry honest at 70 meters in a village street did work a cannon could not. Half-tracks and trucks wore pintles as a matter of course. The ring and post emergency anti-air sight was fitted and used when the sky turned unfriendly, and while the gun was no substitute for 20 millimeters, its presence on a column stretched over miles of bad road made a kind of insurance at the cost of belts that had to be accounted for later. Ammunition practice grew more disciplined. Heavy ball for range work on tripods, tracer laced through belts by rule rather than whim, so a leader could read and talk with light in daylight. Armor piercing and special purpose in smaller allotments for specific jobs. Anti-material, probing thin cover, starting fires. Crews learned to build belts that matched the task, not simply load what the tin held. Quartermasters, who had watched the early campaigns burn through stocks unchecked, now pushed back with allocations that matched doctrine. This many belts per day for the platoon on defense with tripod guns, this many drums for the company that would be moving. It did not stop frantic expenditures in a hard hour, but it gave units a starting point that did not end in empty boxes after a morning's enthusiasm. Behind the line, the weapons industrial story reached a hinge. The same departments that praised the MG34's accuracy on a tripod could see the limits of its manufacture. Receivers and feed covers were still machined in long sequences by skilled hands that Germany could not multiply fast enough. Inspection jigs ran at capacity. Scrap climbed when cutters dulled. Rework swallowed hours that no one could spare in a war now measured against ocean-spanning economies. The answer arrived not as a denunciation of the first design, but as a complement shaped by stamping presses and spot welders rather than mills. A sister receiver that could be made faster, a locking system that tolerated looser fits, and a cyclic rate that turned volume into its own kind of suppression. Batches of this simplified sister began to appear in 1942. They did not replace the MG34 overnight, and for good reasons. The older gun's smooth cadence and tripod manners remained unmatched for precision grazing fire. Its compatibility with armored vehicle mounts was already baked into thousands of hulls, and its crews, trained into its habits, could make it sing in ways no paper comparison could capture. Field commanders adapted to the mix. Company books began to list 2 families of gun where one had been expected. Armorers carried parts for both and kept the right spares with the right receivers by label and by feel. Tactics adjusted at the edges. When a lane needed perfect, even stitching at 800 meters on a low tripod with an optic, the older guns still took pride of place. When a squad needed raw volume to slam a hedge while it crossed a ditch, the newer sister's furious rate showed its value. More often than not, circumstance settled the choice. The gun in hand, maintained by men who trusted it, was the gun that worked. The Lafette itself evolved quietly. Boxes arrived with small improvements, revised cradles, simplified castings, the occasional change in the way a sight bracket was machined. None of it altered the essential, a clockwork that let a man write measured hostility across a strip of ground. In snow, that mattered differently than it did in summer. On a white morning with fog lying low, a pair of tripod guns could hold approaches they could barely see by the numbers set the previous afternoon. 3 clicks left to rake the near ditch, 4 up to tick the far fence. In a season when batteries were stingy and smoke hung, machine gun mathematics kept lines from dissolving under the stress of poor visibility. Crews also refined rituals that manuals barely mentioned. The assistant gunner's mitt, stiff and charred from months of barrel changes, was kept close in a pocket to stay pliant in cold. Belt tins were stacked under a scrap of canvas so condensation would not turn links to rust overnight inside a warm room and a freezing morning. In mud, the team learned to carry a short plank or pick a door off its hinges to make a platform for a prone gun where the earth would not support it. The squad leader carried a grease pencil and a pocket notebook for field sketches. Bearing to a stump, range to a culvert, number of clicks on the Lafette to reach the broken cart that all of them could see even in dusk. When reliefs rotated in at midnight, those sketches changed hands the way water and belts did. For maintenance, unit-level improvisations cut stoppages by simple margins. Cloth bags appeared to keep spare barrels clean. A cut-down paintbrush rode in a pouch to chase grit from feed teeth. A length of wire served as a flexible pick to clear a stubborn speck from an extractor groove. In winter, crews slept with bolts wrapped in rags under greatcoats, not for romance, but because steel that had not taken the night's deep cold would cycle on the first pull. None of this was in procurement ledgers, but every small trick kept the ledger's numbers from turning into field failures. The gun's reputation among enemies hardened accordingly. Allied and Soviet reports from 1942 to 43 described belt-fed German guns that seemed always to find the right height when fields opened and a way to keep bursts low enough to make men crawl again, even when they thought they had beaten the worst of it. They noted, too, the trade-offs. In mud, when a drum ran empty and a belt had to be snapped in quickly, a moment's clumsiness might cost seconds that a magazine-fed light gun would not. In close, the slower, steadier Allied lights were handier at odd angles. But across a hedgerow or winter field, few argued with a crew that could swap a barrel before its pattern spread and then resume a stitch as even as a penciled line. By late 1943, the weapon's place in the order of battle was both assured and bounded. It remained the center of the German squad and the spine of defensive geometry. It remained, in its armored mountings, the companion to every main gun from the first model of a medium tank to the last. It remained a teacher of discipline to crews who wanted to run it hot and learned, sometimes the hard way, to read heat and color instead. Around it, the war had changed. The skies were less friendly. The roads were worse. The numbers on the other side of no man's land had grown. The response, where companies could afford it, was to keep the older gun where measured fire mattered, and to let the faster, rougher sister take the places where industry and weather were crueler to tight tolerances. None of that altered the thing itself when a team took position, receiver opening to a familiar click, a belt laid straight with a practiced hand, the first burst short and low to announce the lane, a mitt closing over a hot barrel at the right second without a word, an optic's crosshairs resting on a notch in a hedge while the T and E knob took 3 slow turns. What changed was the map around it, more arrows pointing the other way, more bridges behind to be guarded, more hours where a gun team's job was to make a piece of ground too expensive to take. In that job, the MG34 remained what it had always been at its best, a precise instrument in practiced hands, exacting in care and generous in effect. By early 1944, the machine gun that had begun life as an elegant answer to 3 separate battlefield roles was doing its work in a very different war. German formations were reorganizing under pressure on 3 fronts at once. Italy's mountains, the hedgerows and strong points of the Atlantic coast, and a long, retreating arc in the east. The MG34 was everywhere inside that picture, on bipods in orchard lanes, on Lafette tripods in stone terraces above river valleys, in armored ball mounts, and in fixed embrasures on coastal bunkers. Its strengths were unchanged: controllable cadence, precision on the tripod, compatibility with vehicle mounts. What had changed were the circumstances in which those strengths had to be paid for. In Italy, the weapon came into its own as a surveyor's tool. The Winter Line and then the Gothic Line were not just maps. They were ground that rose steeply from river flats into terraced hills and monastery heights. Company weapons platoons sighted tripod-mounted guns to rake mule paths and switchbacks with measured traverses, their optical sights already indexed to a whitewashed stone, a lone cypress, the notch of a ridge. The traverse and elevation box on the Lafette, which a corporal had once cursed under a training load, earned its keep every fog-bound morning when a relief crew could, by number alone, reopen a grazing line that the previous team had laid the night before. On the bipod, the same gun acted like a razor at street corners in casinos' rubble or under the chestnut trees above river crossings. Short, flat strings that held a wall while a squad bounded across a lane. Those positions were not improvised each time. By 1944, machine gun sighting had become a routine that platoon leaders could carry out in their sleep. A sector sketch went into a pocket notebook. Bearing and range to the bend in a track. The clicks on the lafette to sweep a terrace. The exact elevation to keep a burst at knee height across a vineyard row. Reliefs rotated on those notes. Ammunition carriers learned the footwork between stash points. Assistant gunners learned how to feed a belt without exposing a shoulder in a window frame blasted down to the sill. Even small, unromantic tricks had become doctrine. A cut-down brush for dust in feed piles. A strip of cloth for wiping the top cover each time the gun fell still. Barrel sleeves nested where they would not take splashed mud. The hidden costs traveled with the technique. Barrels needed to be changed before patterns opened. That meant spare barrels, mitts, and time, none of which came cheaply on a slope where every lift was by hand. Ammunition expenditure had to match expectation. In a day's fighting over a single spur, a platoon's tripod guns could consume belts that would have supplied a company in a different campaign a few years earlier. Quartermasters in the rear wrote discipline into allocations. Heavy ball for longer lanes, tracer laced by rule for communication, drums reserved for short rushes on the bipod, and platoon sergeants enforced it in the field. The weapon's ability to hold a line at 800 meters was only as useful as the cartridges a mule or a truck could bring up the last half-kilometer of rutted track. On the Channel coast and along Normandy's hedgerows, the MG34 shared most positions with its faster-built sister, but it retained niches that commanders protected. In concrete strong points backed by carefully surveyed fields of fire, the steadier cadence and smooth recoil impulse of the older gun-stitched lanes exactly where a strong points plan said they should be. Atlantic wall embrasures used standardized mounts. Many were designed around the family of receivers that included the MG34, and fortress troops drilled to reopen pre-registered lines by number when smoke and dust hid landmarks. Inland, hedgerows turned a machine gun post into an exercise in angles and patience. A bipod gun on the berm cut diagonals across a sunken lane. A tripod gun behind could switch between two gaps in a hedgerow with 3 counted turns of the T and E, buying the seconds that infantry needed to slide from one hedge to the next. When the fight turned and the same strong points were assaulted from the rear, those mounts were stripped and the guns went back to behaving like what they had always been. Receivers with belts and barrels that could be carried out under an arm if there was time. The retreat in the east pressed the gun into a different schedule. Night surveys, day fighting, night relief again. Rivers that had been lines on maps became calendars. The southern bug, the Dniester, the Prut. Later, the Vistula's feeders, and every lesser stream that could stop a vehicle and slow a man. Company weapons platoons did not have time to build textbook positions. They had time to choose 2 or 3 lines a platoon could actually hold with the ammunition on hand. The MG34 on the lafette made those lines real when there was half an hour before dawn and ground fog thick enough to hide a man at 30 paces. On the bipod, gun teams did the unglamorous work of every rear guard. 2 belts to make an orchard lane feel hostile, a barrel change before the group opened, a withdrawal by bounds to the next fold in the ground. Vehicle mounts kept their own rhythm, insulated from some of the weather and ground and exposed to a different set of compromises. The variant designed for armored hulls and coaxial mounts, heavier barrel, different jacket, fired by linkage or solenoid, remained in production specifically because of those mounts. A coaxial burst that shaved a trench line cleared a view for a gunner to work with the main armament. A Hull machine gun covered a blind arc in a street or in the close approaches to a village square. The fact that armor and infantry shared a mechanism mattered in late-war logistics. An armorer trained on the infantry pattern could service a vehicle's mount with familiar gauges and spares. Belts fed the same. Barrel metallurgy and proof marks meant the same things to the same eyes. Where the war demanded improvisation, an armored hull used as a static strongpoint at a roadblock or a pillbox dug into a traffic circle. The interchangeability meant the gun kept running regardless of whether it wore a bipod, a cradle, or a steel ball. Training narrowed as replacements grew younger and the calendar more crowded. In 1937, a recruit might have spent weeks learning to read the gun by feel before ever firing a belt on the range. In 1944, the same recruit arrived at a front-line unit with much of his education written on a single sheet. Strip and assemble. Keep oil thin in cold and scarce in dust. Change barrels before the groups open. Lay belts straight and feed without twist. Close the cover and feel for the spring bite. Veteran, non-commissioned officers took up the slack. A platoon sergeant who had slept with bolt groups under his coat in a Russian winter put a hand on the cocking handle and taught the new man the difference between a clean, dry cycle and a sluggish one long before the first fight could ruin a spring and a morning. Wartime production reforms reached the gun in ways crews could feel without reading factory memos. Receivers that had once been polished smooth now showed machining marks. Blued finishes gave way in places to more utilitarian treatments. Small parts that had been milled arrived as pressings. None of this changed the basic mechanism. It did change how armorers approached inspection. Gauges came out more often, parts were swapped preemptively, and unit workshops, small traveling benches under canvas, held a few more spares that mattered most. Extractors, firing pins, springs, and the locking components that made the bolt head's rotation precise. In the rear, acceptance marks kept their quiet language, a forest of tiny stamps that told an experienced eye whether a receiver had passed through the right hands in the right order. In the field, what mattered was whether the gun ran when belts were fed and the barrel was locked down with the side door's positive click. Ammunition tables evolved to meet the new tempo. Belts were built with intent, tracer at a regular interval for communication in daylight, heavy ball for long tripod work, special purpose rounds issued sparingly and held for jobs that needed their properties. Metal, non-disintegrating belts in 50-round segments remained the norm because they could be linked endlessly in a static fight and broken down for carriage on the move. The short drums that kept a first rush clean in a dusty country remained in service because dust and mud did not care about a doctrinal diagram. The economy of ammunition, in the precise sense of managing a resource, became one more part of the gun's craft. When to use single shots to correct, when to flood a hedge with two fast strings to buy a crossing, when to spend a 250-round box on a tripod because the geometry of the ground demanded it. The universal claim that had defined the design now took on a new meaning. A receiver family that showed up in fortress mounts, truck pintles, hull balls, and coaxial cradles. A trigger system that still let a gunner choose single shots without breaking his grip. A barrel change that a practiced pair could make as quickly in a stairwell as on a river berm. What had been an elegant concept on a drawing board survived precisely because it had settled into hundreds of small, repeatable routines that did not rely on the perfect conditions of a training field. A gunner knew by the smell and the color when a barrel needed to come out. An assistant knew by the feel in his palm when the feed pawls would fight a twisted belt. A squad leader knew by 3 landmarks and a number on a drum where a grazing line would sit even in fog. Allied and Soviet reports from this period recorded the weapon accordingly. They noted that German positions, even when held by mixed equipment, often stitched the exact low lanes that disciplined tripod crews could create. They warned against standing up at ranges that felt safe against ordinary rifle fire. And they observed that, in close, the German belt-fed guns were heavier to handle around tight corners than magazine-fed lights, but that an enemy who thought himself sheltered in a shallow ditch often found otherwise when a Lafette-mounted gun 200 meters away began a measured search. Those observations came with counters of their own: smoke, mortars, heavier automatic fire from the Allied side, but the underlying respect for what a skilled gun team could do with an older receiver did not diminish. In the background, the industrial logic that had introduced a simplified sister to the production lines continued. More of the newer pattern left factories each month, especially for infantry units that needed volume and could accept a rougher cadence in exchange for easier manufacture and looser tolerances. The older gun stayed where its particular virtues were hard to replace: vehicle mounts already built for it, fortress and coastal emplacements designed around its receiver and optics, company machine gun platoons whose leaders knew exactly what its cadence would do to a line of wheat at 700 meters. Armies are conservative when a tool does a job that a commander can name and trust. In 1944, the MG34 still did those jobs, and the men who used it were exact in arranging conditions under which it could do them. By the end of that year, the gulf between what the weapon could deliver and what it demanded had widened in ways no manual could smooth over. Skilled hands were harder to spare, ammunition trains were shorter, and retreats forced crews to abandon tripods they would once have carried another kilometer for the sake of geometry. Yet at a river bend in Poland, on a terrace in the Apennines, or behind an embrasure on a rain-swept coast, the sequence remained recognizable. The receiver opened to a familiar click. A belt was laid straight and fed without twist. The first burst, short and low, announced the lane. A mitt closed on a hot barrel at the practice second, and an optics reticle settled on a landmark already noted in a pocketbook. The machine gun that had been designed to be many things was still exactly itself: precise, demanding, adaptable. And its hidden costs were the same ones that had always been there, only now paid under a harsher light. Winter tightened its grip on every road and river crossing in late 1944, and the MG34 met the new season with the same mix of precision and cost that had defined its life from the beginning. What had once been an army's elegant answer to 3 different roles was now a tool pulled into service wherever the line bent. Terraces in Italy, embrasures along the Atlantic coast, hedgerows receding behind retreating columns in France and Belgium, and the long eastward arc where frozen streams and village streets became defensive geometry. The weapon's pulse was familiar: short, flat strings on the bipod, measured, grazing fire on the Lafette tripod, the side door clack of a hot barrel giving way to a cool one, but everything around it had grown harsher. Trains were fewer, spares traveled farther, crews were younger, and commanders spent their last reliable instruments where precision still paid for itself: in the Apennine fog, and on the ridges above the Arno and the Senio. Tripod-mounted MG34s behaved like surveying tools in stone. Weapons platoons had learned to map hillsides by habit: a cypress for bearing, a whitewashed farmhouse for elevation, a notch in a ridge for the last 3 clicks on the traverse and elevation box. Optical sights, when they could be had, were already indexed to those marks with grease pencil notes in pocketbooks. Reliefs stepped into position at midnight and reopened lanes by number in the morning fog, stitching hostility across mule paths and vineyard rows at knee height while riflemen traded one terrace for the next. On the bipod in towns, casinos, rubble, later crumbling villages along the Gothic line, the gun became a doorstop and a razor at once. Low in a window frame, cutting diagonals across a street. Quick, clipped bursts to freeze the far stairwell, while grenades or a flanking pair finished the job. The same routines took root along Europe's opposite edge, where concrete and compacted soil met the Channel wind. Fortress and coastal units straddled mounts designed around the MG34's receiver family. The steadier cadence and smooth recoil that crews prized on the Lafette tripod made coastal embrasures feel like metronomes. Strong points had pre-registered lines. Optics, when not broken or borrowed for the next post inland, were marked to reopen those lines by number under smoke. Inland, hedgerows and sunken lanes demanded patience and angle work. A bipod gun on a berm cut a diagonal. A tripod gun behind it switched between two gaps with 3 slow turns of the T and E, buying seconds for a squad sliding along the hedge. When those same strong points were taken from the rear, mounts were stripped and the guns returned to their simplest shape: a receiver, a belt, a bipod, and a pair of hands that knew the sequence by feel. Farther north and west, winter woods and the broken villages of the Ardennes drew the MG34 back into offensive movements that felt, for a few days, like another era. Snow hid silhouettes. Short December light made muzzle flash a signal as much as a hazard. In the trees, the gun's controllable cadence mattered more than raw volume. Fire discipline, 2 or 3 short strings to nail down a tree line, single shots to walk correction without lighting the whole wood. Let patrols slide a few dozen meters at a time. Tracer laced through belts by rule rather than whim, turned bursts into speech. Left gun on, right gun shift, mortars up. Cold made its own demands. Crews learned to keep bolts dry and warm under coats, to cycle the action by hand before loading at dawn, to oil sparingly with thin grades that would not turn to glue in the first minutes of shooting. Those habits, and a mitt pliant enough to grab a hot barrel without cracking in the frost, separated a gun that answered the first burst from one that sulked and cost its team a morning. On the Eastern Front, the weapon served a calendar of rivers. Winter iced the crossings. Spring thawed them into traps. Summer laid dust thick as ash on every belt and feed cover. Autumn pulled the Lafette's feet into clay. Through it all, the same geometry paid. A company with 2 or 3 tripod guns could hold approaches it could not see under ground fog, because the numbers on the sight drum and the clicks on the traverse, clamp, still meant what they had meant the afternoon before. A bipod gun could be counted on to turn an orchard lane into discomfort for the span of 2 belts, then fall back by bounds to a fresh fold in the ground. Where roads narrowed into villages, the gun's universal claim showed its practical side. 6 men turned a truck bed into a firing post. A cellar window became a low, stable sill. A door pulled from its hinges became a platform over mud that would not carry a prone gun. Vehicle mounts, insulated from some of the weather and exposed to others, kept their own rhythm. The armored vehicle variant, built for coaxial and ball mounts, fired by linkage or solenoid, still occupied every hull. Coaxial bursts shaved trench lines so a main gun could work. A hull machine gun covered blind arcs along streets and hedgerows. The practical virtue of a shared mechanism counted double now. Armorers trained on the infantry pattern serviced vehicle mounts with familiar gauges. Belts were belts wherever they were fed. Spare parts traveled in the same tins. When tired vehicles were dug in as strong points, hulls sunk to their skirts in traffic circles or on road spurs. The same receiver that had started its day on a tripod ended it behind a steel ball mount, answering the same belts and the same barrels with the same side door latch. All of this depended on logistics that no longer moved as they had. Allied bombing and the strain of a long war simplified finishes and altered tolerances. Receivers that had once been polished smooth left mills with visible cutter marks. Blued parts gave way to more utilitarian treatments. Small components that had been milled became pressings. Armorers felt the difference in their fingers. Gauges came out more often. Preemptive swaps replaced wait and see. Unit workshops, benches under canvas with a vise, a drill, a handful of jigs, kept extractors, firing pins and springs in a small, jealously guarded reserve. Letter-coded inspection marks, meant to conceal origin, turned into a quiet language for men who had learned to read them. This receiver had been through the right hands. That bolt face had been ground within spec. Those pawls had the good springs. In the field, what mattered was simpler. Did the cover close with a spring-clean bite? Did the bolt unlock by hand without stick? Did the hot barrel seat with a click you could feel through a glove? Ammunition discipline hardened alongside every other economy. Belts were built with intent. Heavy bore for tripod lanes, tracer at fixed intervals for communication, special purpose rounds issued sparingly and saved for jobs that needed their properties. Drum carriers kept their first 50-rounders for short rushes under dust. Long belts stayed in tins until the ground firmed. Quartermasters, who had watched enthusiastic crews bleed stocks white in earlier years, matched allotments to circumstances. This many linked belts for the day on defense. This many drums for companies that would move by bounds. This many 250-round boxes for trench-length curtains that a platoon leader had already drawn in pencil onto the landscape. It did not stop a hard hour from doubling any plan's figures, but it gave a starting point that did not end in empty boxes by noon. Training compressed without surrendering the essentials. Replacements learned on a sheet of instructions what earlier cohorts had been taught in weeks. Strip and assemble. Keep oil thin in cold and scarce in dust. Change barrels before groups opened. Feed belts straight, feel for the feed pal's bite when the cover's shut. Veteran non-commissioned officers closed the gap the old way, hands on a cocking handle, moving it through a stroke until right and wrong lived in a recruit's palm more sure than in his head. On the tripod, the mathematics remained the same even when the optics did not. If the sight was missing, a corporal with a notebook and a steady hand could still set bearing and elevation by the T and E clamps and his own range card, and hold a strip of ground by number at dusk. Urban defense glued all of those habits together. Fortress cities and ad hoc strong points, Königsberg's defenses, the rings around Breslau and Posen, the smaller towns that thickened along the Oder, were not abstract lists in an order of battle. They were floor plans and firing angles. Machine gun posts lived in rooms. A tripod sat back from a window whose lower half had been bricked in to make a narrow slit. A lane swept diagonally across the street to the opposite stairwell, where an assistant gunner on another floor listened for the MG's cadence and timed his own bursts to cross it. Field telephones, when wire existed, stitched posts into a web. When wire did not, pocket notebooks and a leader's voice did the work. Panzerfaust men took their cues from machine gun lanes. The gun held infantry to ground while the one-shot tube looked for a side angle. If armor forced the turn, the gun shifted 2 clicks and the room's geometry changed again. There were rooftops and roads where the gun still swung skyward. Truck columns mounted improvised posts and the official AA tripods alike, fitting ring and post sights in minutes to give the illusion, and sometimes the reality, of a bite against low, harrying aircraft. No one mistook an 8mm gun for a flak cannon, but a column that stitched a sky with tracers at the right second could make a pilot pull up or brake, and sometimes that was all the road needed. The arithmetic was brutal. Belts spent on sky were belts not in tins for the next crossroads. Commanders waited by habit now, not by doctrine. One short curtain through the gap. Save the rest for the lane you could control. The hidden cost that had shadowed the MG34 from the start now sat in the open ledger of a nation fighting on every frontier. Time on mills that could not be multiplied. Hands that could not be taught their craft overnight. Tripods that were worth their weight only if someone could haul them to the right floor at the right hour. And ammunition whose economy decided whether a lane held for 10 minutes or 20. Industry had answered with a simplified sister that stamped and welded where the older gun had been carved and milled. And that sister filled more and more racks in infantry companies. Yet the older receiver remained in places where its particular virtues were hard to replace, in vehicle mounts already built for it, on tripods where the gentler cadence and smooth impulse wrote grazing lines at exact heights, in fortress embrasures where an optic and a T&E box turned the street into an instrument. By the first thaw of 1945, the map around the gun had changed more than the mechanism in its crew's hands. Columns fell back on rivers and rose over them again as retreats became lines and lines became calendars. Crews still checked the bolt's feel with a glove before loading, laid belts straight and kept the first burst short and low to announce a lane. Assistant gunners still reached for a mitt at a practice second and seated a fresh barrel by sound as much as sight. Platoon leaders still opened notebooks and set traverse drums to numbers that matched a stump, a culvert, a church spire. When orders called for a rear guard, tripod feet bit into stairwells and cellar floors. When orders called for a stand, optics were dusted, range cards laid out, and the metronome returned. The MG34 had become what its first advocates had wanted and what its critics had warned. A precise instrument that rewards care and punishes neglect. A universal receiver that can be many things only if the men around it keep their end of the bargain. A cost paid in machine hours, in training minutes, and in the cubic space of a wagon for tripods and optics that turn a line on a map into a hostile place to walk. Under winter light on the last long rivers, that bargain still held. The gun answered belts with a cadence that platoon leaders knew by ear, and the ground in front of it answered back with the same grudging respect it had shown from the first day a squad leader set a lane at knee height and told his men, "Here and no farther." Snow withdrew from verges and ditches in thin, dirty bands, and with it went the last concealment that winter had given gun teams. By late February 1945, the MG34's work looked the same in every theater, and nothing like the same war. In Italy, the tripod and optic still measured terraces by the click. In the West, hedgerows and town squares flicked past as columns fell back to river lines. In the East, frozen crossings loosened into black water and clay, and every lane that could be held for an hour was worth the belts it would cost. The receiver's sounds remained familiar. Feed covers shut with a spring-clean bite, bolt tested by hand before first light. The side door clack of a hot barrel giving way to a cool one. But around those rituals, the calendar had accelerated. Trains ran shorter, spares arrived in mixed lots. Crews were younger, and the men who knew why a sluggish first pull meant field strip now were spread thin across too many platoons. On the Oder front, the gun's old promise, turn ground into a measured problem, was asked to carry more than it ever had. The defensive lines east of Berlin were not continuous walls. They were pieces of geometry pinned to spires, culverts, coppices, and the bare shoulders of the silo heights. Weapons platoons sketched their sectors with the same economy they had used on the Volga and the Dnieper. A church tower gave bearing. A chalked tree line fixed elevation. The traverse and elevation box on the Lafette kept the rest honest. When morning ground fog held, relief crews opened lanes by number, not by sight, stitching knee-high hostility across the approaches a company commander had drawn in pencil the night before. It was the same metronome the gun had beaten since Poland, only now the orchestra around it was smaller and the audience closer. Urban positions tightened the frame. In Kustrin's ruins, and then, street by street, on Berlin's outskirts, the MG34 lived in rooms. A tripod sat a pace or two back from a window whose lower half had been bricked into a firing slit. The optic, if there was one, was already indexed in a pocketbook. 3 turns to sweep the opposite stairwell, 2 clicks down to rake the tram line. In cellars, bipod guns became doorstops. Short, flat strings cut diagonals across a corridor. Single shots walked a correction on a landing without giving the position away with an overlong muzzle flash. Assistant gunners learned to feed belts by feel under their elbows so a shoulder didn't show in the slit. Squad leaders learned to borrow a tripod from the company weapons platoon whenever a block had to be held through the hours when smoke lay and landmarks vanished. The city demanded more than geometry. It asked for craft. A plank tucked under a prone gun turned churned earth into a platform when floors were gone. A cut-down brush in a pouch chased fine grit from feed piles after every string. A rag wrapped around a bolt and kept under a coat through the night made the first pull at dawn a certainty rather than a prayer on steel that had taken the deep cold. Crews taped a spare barrel sleeve shut so rubble wouldn't seed it with grit. Assistant gunners kept the mitt in a pocket so leather wouldn't crack in frost. These were small things, and they had always been small things, but at the end of the war, they were the only margin most crews had left. Vehicle mounts kept their rhythm despite everything. The armored vehicle variant, heavier jacket, different furniture, fired by linkage or solenoid, still lived coaxially and in ball mounts, answering to the same belts and barrels as the infantry pattern. In streets where a main gun could not clear a view, a coaxial burst shaved a trench lip or a window frame and bought seconds to load high explosive. Hull guns held blind arcs in alleys. When a tired hull was dug in as a roadblock, sunk to the skirts with only the ball mount showing, the continuity mattered. The same receiver family, the same locking lugs, the same extractor and spring from the same tins in the unit workshop. Universal meant exactly that in these weeks. Whatever cradle the gun dropped into, it ran if men kept up their end of the bargain. Clean belts, thin oil in cold, barrel changes before patterns opened. In the West, Rhine crossings and the push into the German interior wrote a different kind of test. Rivers were scheduled more than lines. On a fogged March morning, a pair of tripod guns raked a ferry point by number until engineers had bridged enough to move a platoon. By afternoon, the same guns were strapped to a truck bed and turned into a traveling rear guard as the front broke and ran. Strong points that had faced seaward now fired inland. Embrasures designed around the MG34's receiver and sight brackets stitched pre-registered lanes that fortress troops could reopen even when smoke hid every landmark. When those posts fell, mounts were stripped and the guns returned to their simplest form, receiver, belt, bipod, and left the concrete behind with the last carts. Discipline around ammunition hardened into habit because it had to. Tracer was laced by rule, not whim, so bursts could speak in daylight, shift left, lift, hold. Heavy ball fed the tripod lanes that reached across a square or along a river boulevard. Drums were hoarded for dust and rubble where a short rush had to stay clean. Quartermasters with fewer wagons crawled their pencils across allocations. This many linked belts for the day on defense. This many 250-round boxes for the trench-length curtains a lieutenant had already drawn on his sector's sketch. This many drums for squads that would move by bounds. A hard hour doubled any plan's figures, but a plan existed, and the plan kept a belt for noon that would otherwise have been burned by 10. Acceptance stamps and Kriegsmodel shortcuts, once the language of factory floors, reached the front in the feel of parts. Receivers showed cutter marks. Bluing gave way to faster finishes. Small parts that had been milled arrived as pressings. Armorers ran gauges more often and swapped parts before failure. In a tented bay behind a station, a benchman who had measured locking lugs for years could read a bolt face with a thumbnail and know if it would steal a minute from a gun team in a stairwell or give it back. The ledgers that had once balanced man-hours against output no longer stayed in depots. They lived in the hands that closed a feed cover and felt the spring bite. The gun's silhouette against the sky did not disappear entirely. Truck columns still fitted ring and post sights on improvised pedestals, and crews still stitched the air at low, harrying aircraft. No one mistook 7.92 millimeters for a flak battery, but a sky seeded with tracer could make a pilot climb or veer. And sometimes that was all a column needed to keep moving. The arithmetic was severe. Belts to the sky were belts not on a tripod, and someone with a pencil and a ration sheet made the call every time. By April, Berlin's map had become a floor plan. Posts lived by room numbers and stair counts. Machine gun lanes were measured in door widths. A tripod sat in a room with its slit bricked. A pocket card said stairwell opposite, 410 meters, 3 clicks right, 1 up. Panzerfaust men took their cues from the gun's cadence. Flat strings held infantry to ground, while a one-shot tube angled for the track of the next tank. When steel forced the turn, the gun shifted 2 clicks and the room's geometry changed again. Field telephones stitched posts when wire existed. When it didn't, voices did, and tracer spoke where voices could not carry. Even at this end of the war, the MG34 kept its one advantage that no simplification could match. On the Lafette at range, its cadence and recoil impulse made a grazing line behave like pencil on paper. Platoon leaders trusted that line in fog and smoke more than they trusted most other tools they had left. It was the same trust that had been earned on a range before Poland, on riverbanks before Kursk, and in the ruins above the Dnieper. It had cost barrels and belts and time on mills and young hands taught in a hurry. It still paid back more often than it failed. Hidden costs stood in the open now. A weapon that rewarded care punished neglect. A receiver that had taken dozens of machining steps through years of war still asked for clean belts and thin oil and a barrel change by feel. Tripods that weighed what they weighed still bought geometry at the price of backs and minutes. Training time that had once stretched weeks was compressed into a few nights under a sergeant's hand and a cocking handle. Yet amid shortages and improvisation, the bargain, precision in exchange for discipline, held wherever men had the will and the seconds to keep it. When the last bridges were dropped and the last city blocks were mapped by room instead of street, the gun's endgame looked like its beginning in miniature. A receiver laid on a sill, a belt fed straight, the first burst short and low to announce the lane. A mitt on a hot barrel at the practiced second. A traverse drum set by a number in a notebook. Ground answered the way it had always answered, grudgingly. And if the room fell, the gun left by the back stair, side door latched, spare barrel sleeve tugged closed, the team already counting steps to the next place where a line drawn at knee height could still mean no farther. The war would stop soon. But the MG34 story did not end in the silence. It remained in crates and in vehicle hulls, in fortress mounts along coasts that no longer mattered, in police armories, and in the hands of men who learned after the fighting how a double crescent trigger felt when you wanted a single shot, then a measured string. The ledgers that had forced Germany to seek a simpler sister were waiting in drawers. Man-hours, scrap rates, stoppage reports from sand and snow, and their arithmetic would be read in a different light. For the crews who had lived with the gun to the last thaw, the sums had never been abstract. They were the weight of a tripod on a stair, the click of a feed cover that meant ready, and a line across a street that felt, for one more hour, like control. Spring thinned the snow into seams along verges and cart ruts, and with it thinned the concealment that had favored careful crews. The MG34 kept doing what it had always done. Flat, disciplined strings on the bipod, measured, grazing fire from a Lafette, while everything around it turned faster and rougher. In April and May, when maps were read by stairwell and culvert more than by town and river, the gun's familiar ritual still opened each watch. Feed cover shut with a clean spring bite. Bolt worked once by hand to feel for sluggish steel. A spare barrel checked and stowed where a gloved hand could find it without looking. Those Hibbets bought minutes in rooms and at road bends when minutes were the only currency left. When the shooting stopped, the reckoning that had been building behind it for years came out of the drawers and onto tables. In ordnance offices and factory boardrooms, the MG34 was reduced to columns, machining steps, inspection jigs, cycle times, scrap percentages, gauge hours, training hours, spare parts drawers per 1,000 rounds. No single figure damned it, the sum did. The receiver that had once been a point of pride, carved, ground, and lapped into a slick, compact mechanism, meant machine time that could not be shifted to other priorities. The feed cover's precise pawls demanded springs tempered just so and inspectors who could feel the difference between right and almost. The barrel's quick change door, a marvel when men were rested and stocks were full, drew its own train of mitts, sleeves, gauges, and spares. In a national ledger, those beautiful details appeared as line items that multiplied. The contrast sitting across the table was the simplified sister that had arrived during the war and had taken more and more rack space by 1944, stamped and welded where the older gun had been machined, tolerant of rougher fits and dirtier weather, faster to build, and therefore available in the numbers a continental war actually demanded. Commanders had known the difference in their bones long before a clerk typed it. If you needed geometry, repeatable lanes at distance on a tripod, you reached for the smoother, steadier cadence. If you needed volume, raw suppression against a hedge or a trench lip, you reached for the faster pulse. The ledgers simply made the choice durable after peace returned, and the procurement memos that followed formalized what units had been improvising for years. The MG34 would remain where its particular virtues could not be replaced without redesigning mounts and doctrine, coaxial and hull guns in armored vehicles, fortress and coastal embrasures, places where its manners on the Lafette still paid back their weight. Everywhere else, the cheaper receiver and the faster line won. The armored mounts were a world of their own, and they explained better than any balance sheet why the older receiver never disappeared. Vehicle interiors had been designed around the MG34's form, its barrel jacket proportions, its cocking geometry, its ejection and feed paths. Coaxial cradles and ball mounts did not forgive substitutions easily. A tank gunner who shaved a trench lip with a short burst before sending a high-explosive shell valued the smooth, predictable impulse. A hull gun that covered a blind arc on a city corner answered to the same belts and the same spares the company armorer already knew. Even in 1945, as factories simplified finishes and swapped milling for pressings on small parts, contracts for the armored variant kept running because mounts and muscle memory made it the practical choice. While those papers were being stamped, the hardware took on a second life across borders. Warehouses filled with captured receivers, tripods, and tins did not sit long. Allied depots sorted and sold. Some lots went into training inventories. Others crossed frontiers by crate and rail flat. New users cared less about the weapon's place in German doctrine than about what it could be made to do for them now. In places where ammunition remained 7.92 by 57 millimeters for years after the war, the guns ran on their original diet. In places that shifted to a new standard caliber, workshops rebarreled and retimed feed where it could be done economically. Police and border units liked the tripod's calm and the gun's precise single-shot control for posts that were supposed to signal control rather than drown a problem in noise. Armies that found themselves short of vehicle weapons for half-tracks and towers discovered what German armories had known. A receiver that drops into many cradles is a receiver that stays busy. Not all of the diaspora ran on government letterhead. Post-war scrap lines became small, unmarked factories of their own, bins of bolts and feed covers and locking pieces that clever hands assembled into working guns or into spares that kept them alive somewhere far from a factory gate. A Lafette tripod with a missing optic found new glass. A receiver with a scarred finish but a sound bore returned to service behind a parapet that had never seen a T&E box before. The same small rituals followed. Keep belts clean if you can, oil sparingly in dust, swap barrels before patterns wander, even when the men performing them had learned the motions from a sergeant who spoke a different language on a different front. Doctrine moved on, and here the MG34 left a mark that mattered more than any crate sale. Its central idea, the universal machine gun that could be light on a bipod, sustained on a tripod, and adapted to vehicles, outlived the gun's production run. The tripod's traverse and elevation box, the range drums that turned landmarks into numbers, the expectation that a squad's energy revolves around a belt-fed gun while riflemen protect and feed it. These were not museum habits. They reappeared, refitted to new calibers and new feed systems in the general-purpose machine guns that defined the next generation. Designers elsewhere mixed and matched ideas, a feed that owed much to one German lineage mated to an action drawn from another. A sturdy receiver that traded elegance for endurance paired with sights that still made geometry possible for a corporal with a pocket notebook. The gun that had seemed a peacetime answer fielded into total war turned out to be the teacher for peacetime design feeding into Cold War planning. The accounting story, the one promised at the very beginning, turns in the end on time. Not simply hours on a mill, but hours everywhere. Hours in a training schedule to turn a recruit's hand into a gauge. Hours in a platoon sergeant's day to walk a line and write ranges in a pocketbook. Hours in a column to get a tripod where it belongs. Hours for a factory to deliver the next crate of spares before a crew learns to make do without them. The MG34 demanded more of those hours than its successor. In the early years, the Army paid happily because the return in control and precision felt immediate. As the war widened and the arithmetic grew harsh, the ledgers argued for the simpler build. After the war, when procurement did not have to buy for 3 fronts at once, the old balance returned, where mounts and method made the most of the older gun's manners. It was worth keeping. Where numbers mattered most, new receivers took the field. What remained for the men who had carried it from the first campaign to the last was quieter than any doctrine. In letters and in conversations years later, the details they remembered were not statistics. They were sensory, The way a good feed cover shut with a snap you felt in your palm. The smell of hot steel just before you changed a barrel. The weight of a tripod's rear leg on a stair when you were already out of breath. The scratch of a grease pencil on a card that said stump 600, hedge 850, 3 clicks left. They remembered the reassurance of a first burst that sat where it should because a routine had been kept in the dark, and the bitter seconds when a lazy habit turned into a stoppage. The gun rewarded care and punished neglect. That was the bargain from 1934 to 1945 and beyond. Even in peace, the old routines echoed. A border post on a windy ridge kept a tripod lane sketched to a rock that had not moved in 100 years. A training range in a country that had not existed when the gun was designed taught recruits to press the upper face of a double crescent trigger for a single and the lower for a short, controlled burst. A retired armorer in a small workshop, confronted with a scarred receiver and a box of mixed parts, still ran a thumbnail over a locking lug out of a reflex before reaching for a gauge. Those gestures were the last ledger, habits written in hands rather than in numbers, and they are the reason the MG34's afterlife stretched so far past its production run. If you pick up the story by its themes rather than its dates, the hidden cost that sat under the gun from the beginning looks less like a bill and more like a choice. Precision or throughput, discipline or indulgence, geometry or volume. The MG34 stood on one side of each of those pairs. It offered a way to make ground behave like a chart, to tie a squad to a metronome of fire that steadied nerves and fixed lanes. In return, it asked for clean belts, attentive hands, and factory time that could not be conjured in a crisis. The fact that another design won most of the procurement fights by 1944 does not erase what the older gun gave. It only sharpens its outline. A machine made to be many things, which taught generations after it how to decide what matters when you cannot have everything. And that is how the weapon closes its own circle. It began as a peacetime ambition dressed for war, one receiver to do the work of 3. It ended as a teacher of method, a kit of parts that outlived its factories, and a ledger entry that convinced an army to buy differently without forgetting what geometry and cadence can do for a small unit with its back to a lane. The rooms are empty now. The tripods sit in museums. The crates have been opened in a dozen languages. But the lane, knee-high, measured, repeatable, still exists whenever a gun team takes a careful breath and sets a line by number before the first burst. The ceasefire did not silence the habits the gun had taught. In workshops and depots, where crates were opened and ledgers tallied, the MG34 lay on benches under a different light. No longer a squad's center of gravity, but a machine to be understood as a whole. What it gave, what it asked, and why its lines on paper had cost what they did in mills, in training hours, in the cubic space of a wagon. The men who set it down on oiled cloth reached for the same points they had in a cellar, on a ridge, or behind a slit. Feed cover first, then the bolts stroke by hand, because a weapon that had lived by routine was best judged by the routine it required. At a glance, the mechanism still looked simple. A compact receiver, a rotating bolt head that locked into a barrel extension, a short recoil dance that pushed both back together and then let the bolt continue alone. In the hand, the simplicity dissolved into tolerances. The bolt head had to rotate just so for primary extraction to be strong without tearing brass. The cam path had to force that rotation in a small, smooth arc. The return spring needed enough margin to chamber a round in dust or cold without slamming so hard that parts bruised themselves over months of service. Gauges told stories here that a line item never could. A headspace gauge that slid in with the right feel saved a crew a stoppage weeks later. A locking lug face that showed even faint burnishing under a thumbnail meant the cam had been cut true, and the bolt was sharing force across its shoulders instead of chewing one lug bald. The feed cover, hinged like a lid, but more like a watch, was the other place a hand learned truth. Beneath it, Powell's walked a belt, half a step open, half a step shut. Steady progress that depended on springs tempered to a narrow band, and a geometry that accepted a belt presented square and clean and did not forgive a twist. The bite, when the cover closed, felt through a glove in winter, felt through a film of dust in summer, was not poetry. It was a test as strict as any inspector's stamp. A spring that had gone soft with heat or age, robbed a crew of seconds on a day when seconds were the one currency no one could print. Heat and accuracy were a second ledger written in steel. The barrel was neither as light as a carbines nor as heavy as a water-cooled tube. It had to be stiff enough to print a string, where a corporal had marked a hedge on his card, and thin enough to shed heat before dispersion blew patterns open. The quick change door on the receiver's right side, easy to romanticize in a manual, existed because precision depends on temperature long before it depends on rhetoric. In sustained fire, a tube that continued to give a straight stitch for a few hundred rounds was virtues balanced. Past that, steel scruples were the same in every season. Groups walked, then wandered, then forgave nothing. Crews who changed early were called meticulous. Crews who changed on time were called alive. The mitt, stiffened and blackened by months of work, and the chamois-lined sleeve that kept grit from the spare. These were the small objects that turned a theory about heat into a habit that preserved accuracy. Trigger and cadence were doctrine printed in metal. The double crescent bow, upper face for single, lower for automatic, was not an affectation. It put economy under an index finger. A gunner holding a lane on a terrace could choose to correct with singles without breaking grip. A squad leader could call for a 2-second wash by voice and get it without a hand leaving the pistol grip. The cyclic rate, high enough to punish a lane, low enough to keep bursts controllable on a bipod, made the gun an instrument instead of a fire hose. On a tripod, where the traverse and elevation box enforced measured motion and the optic turned landmarks into numbers, that steadier cadence let grazing fire behave like geometry across minutes, not moments. The Lafette itself, clumsy until it mattered, explained why the weapon kept its place at company level even when simpler receivers arrived on the line. The T&E gears, hard, small teeth under a hand wheel, a clamp that held bearing like a vow. Let one man own a strip of ground measured in clicks and meters. An optic, when present, was sight and memory both. Range drums were cut to a standard cartridge, and a corporal with a notebook could index a church spire at one distance and a hedgerow at another, then hand the post to a relief at midnight with instructions written as numbers. 3 left, 1 up. Wait on the quarter minute. Repeat. Where fog lay in a valley, a lane that had been drawn at dusk could be reopened at dawn by arithmetic. The machine gun's glamour, such as it ever had one, was here, quiet, repeatable, and useful long after a shout could not carry past a war. Belts and tins were the plumbing that doctrine forgot to love. The short 50-round belt that sat in its drum was a way to keep a rush clean in dust, not a fetish. Useful on the move, discarded at the first fold of ground in favor of long segments that could be linked into curtains. The long belts, mostly in 50-round sections, came coiled in tins like lengths of chain, and a crew's success with them depended on a small discipline. Feed straight. Keep the first bend soft. Don't let the links take a set in a box under weight. Ammunition types, handled by quartermasters with sharper pencils as the war wore on, mattered at the post as well as on a ledger. Heavy ball for long tripod work. Tracer laced for daylight speech. Left, lift, hold. Rather than for theatrics, special rounds in sachets held for a task and not for a mood. A belt was a sentence. Squads that wrote in clauses and periods lived longer than squads that shouted in exclamation points. Maintenance, the unglamorous companion of every good design, made or unmade reputations. Dust punished oil. Cold punished oil of the wrong kind. Mud punished everything indiscriminately. A feed path wiped with a scrap of cloth, after each string cut stoppages by a margin no procurement memo could record. A bolt that was cycled by hand before loading at dawn told a palm whether steel had stiffened in the night. A spare barrel sleeve kept closed with a strap turned out a spare that did not seed grit into a locking shoulder. In summer, oil was a rumor. In winter, it had to be as thin as the morning's air. Manuals and addenda gave rules. Veteran sergeants gave the touch that made rules real. This much here, none there. And if it feels like this, stop and strip. Armored mounts kept the weapon alive in places no simplification could reach. Coaxial cradles and ball mounts had been designed around the MG34's proportions. The way its jacket sat in a collar, the way its cocking handle cleared a shield, the path spent brass took to keep from filling a sprocket well. The armored variant, heavier jacket, different furniture, fired by linkage or solenoid, was the same animal under the paint. A coaxial burst that shaved a trench lip bought seconds for a main gun. A hull gun that painted an alley at knee height kept infantry honest in a square. Armories appreciated the continuity because the continuity saved them. The same gauges checked the same faces. Belts were belts, whether fed from a pintle or into a ball. Spare parts binned under letter codes fit where they were supposed to, without a tourniquet and a prayer. It was easy in peacetime to call these things craft, and they were. They were also the engine of cost that accountants finally set in type. Every place where the weapon rewarded care demanded care. Tight fits meant time under cutters, time under gauges, time under hands that didn't learn their trade in a fortnight. The receiver that made a squad leader feel like a surveyor had taken dozens of machining steps. The feed cover that shut with a spring-clean snap had relied on tempered parts cut to a narrow feel. The quick change barrel door saved a day 100 times and charged for everyone with chamois, mitts, extra steel, and the training that turned change the barrel from instruction into reflex. None of these were sins. Stacked, they were a budget. In the field, that budget often came due in wagons and minutes, space for tripods and optics, time to carry them to a stairwell, a plan drawn at noon that made all that weight make sense at dusk. In the factories, the budget sat on boards as numbers, scrap in receivers when cutters went dull, rework on feed covers when springs took a bad temper, bottlenecks in heat treat when a furnace coughed, and a week's worth of parts drifted into hold. Wartime shortcuts smudged the finish without changing the story. Letter-coded inspection marks replaced names. Bluing gave way to quicker treatments. Some small parts came as pressings rather than as milled pieces. Armorers felt the change and reached more often for gauges. Crews, far away, knew only whether the cover shut with the right bite and the bolt unlocked by hand without a scrape. The reputation that enemies wrote down had been earned across all of this. Reports that crossed the lines in 1944 and 1945, then settled into archives after, said the same things. Lo, even stitching at distance from tripod posts, a punishing lane at knee height that made men crawl. In close, more to handle around corners than lighter, magazine-fed guns. In dust, eager to punish sloppiness. In cold, eager to punish the wrong oil. Friendly reports, written with less restraint and more frustration when wagons ran late, said the same things from the other side. The strength of a universal receiver was in the way it turned a discipline into an advantage. The cost of a universal receiver was in the way it demanded that discipline without apology. In the years that followed, the gun had two afterlives, one in metal, one in ideas. The metal traveled in crates, to vehicle parks that needed a coaxial gun yesterday, to border posts that liked the tripod's calm and the single-shot control the double crescent made easy, to training grounds where ammunition matched the old caliber for years and no one saw a reason to give up a system that still did what it said it would do. Workshops rebarreled where standards changed. Feed timing was nudged when it needed to be. Optics found new glass or were replaced by peep and post, the traverse drum doing as much of the old optics work as it reasonably could. In that quiet, unadvertised work, the MG34 behaved as it always had. So long as the belts were kept clean, oil was used sparingly, and barrels were changed before steel spoke in wandering lines. The ideas traveled farther. The universal claim that had been ambition in the 1930s became consensus after. Designers in other countries took what had been proved: one receiver, many mounts, a light bipod and a sustained fire tripod, a feed that accepted long belts without apology, an expectation that the squad revolves around the machine gun's lane instead of around the rifleman's aim, and wrote it in new calibers and new stampings. The traverse and elevation box reappeared in different cases with different knobs. Range drums arrived calibrated to new ballistics. Doctrine that trained a gun team to think in minutes and meters rather than simply in targets and bursts became a staple. The MG34's ledger entries, the ones that tipped a wartime decision toward a simpler, faster build, did not erase its lesson. They trimmed it and made it portable. What remained for the men who had kept it alive under every sky was the feel of the thing, and that, too, was a kind of account. They remembered the snap of a good feed cover, the smell of hot oil and steel a second before a barrel change, the way a tripod leg bit a stair edge and told you through your shoulder that it would hold, the mute reassurance of a first burst that sat exactly where it should because someone had wiped a feed path in the dark. They remembered, with equal clarity, the petty betrayals that were only ever their own. The lazy oiling that turned to glue at dawn. The belting dumped into a tin and set hard by a night's vibration. The barrel swap left a minute too long because no one wanted to break a rhythm. The gun made those differences visible, and the ground confirmed them. So a chapter that began with benches and ledgers ends in hands and habits. The MG34's hidden cost was written in steel and in time, but it was also written in attention, a bill paid by men who learned to feel a bolt's first inch in the morning and to trust a traverse drum's numbers at noon. When peace filed the last papers, that bargain remained. Precision in exchange for discipline, geometry in exchange for weight, a metronome's control in exchange for hours under cutters and the insistence on care. Other receivers would answer the same questions with different arithmetic. The lines the MG34 had stitched, low, even, measured, would still be the lines a careful crew drew when it wanted ground to behave, and the ledgers that had once forced a change would quietly concede that, in the right place, the old balance still made sense. Captured weapons tables were still laid out in barracks and ordnance schools long after the ceasefire. The MG34 sat there beside its peers, Bren and Browning, DP and SG43, Breda and Hotchkiss, each an answer to the same set of problems asked in different languages. The inspectors who walked those tables were not just counting features. They were trying to understand why the German squad had been built around a belt-fed gun with a tripod that behaved like a measuring instrument, while other armies had centered their tactics on lighter automatics or on heavy weapons pushed up by teams. Across those benches, the distinctions began with feed and ended with doctrine. Magazine-fed lights like the British Bren and the Soviet DP moved easily and came back into action with a slap of a fresh magazine. They asked for less choreography in the dirt, but paid for it in dwell time. 30 rounds in a curved box, 47 in a pan, quick to change, quick to empty. Belt-fed guns like the MG34, the American M1919 on its ground mount, and the Soviet SG43 demanded more setup and more hands, but repaid that effort with curtains measured in minutes rather than bursts. The German choice, to make the squad revolve around a belt-fed center, looked inevitable on paper once you understood the Lafette and the way leaders were taught to mark ground by number. To an army that prized mobility over geometry, the Bren's calm and the BAR's quick, authoritative voice made equal sense. Accuracy and cadence wrote the next contrast. The Bren's reputation for point control, its slow, even pulse and steady sight picture, gave a section a comforting precision at hedgerow and wall. The DP's broad shoulders and pan magazine made it honest and forgiving in dust and cold. The MG34 matched both for control from its bipod and surpassed them on the tripod, where the Lafette and optic turned a lane into a number that could be handed across a relief. The price was not subtle. Belts had to be kept clean, barrels changed before groups walked, the traverse and elevation box hauled to a place where its weight could be made to matter. The gun was excellent wherever there was time, space, and purpose to make it excellent. Rate of fire, so often reduced to anecdotes, was in practice a matter of what you were trying to do. The MG34's cadence on a bipod was brisk enough to own a lane and calm enough to hold it without walking off it. On the tripod, its even pulse made the grazing line feel inexorable. When a faster receiver entered service alongside it, the difference sounded dramatic and looked useful in close. Raw volume that punished a hedge or a wall, but for measured long lanes at knee height. The older gun's manners were a feature, not a flaw. Platoon leaders who had learned to set 3 clicks right and 1 up trusted the steadier pulse more than they trusted anything noisy. Resupply put muscle behind those judgments. A Bren crew lived out of a stack of 30-round magazines. Load discipline mattered, but a bent lip or a weak spring could be swapped by feel in seconds. A DP crew learned to treat pan magazines like china in the field. A dent in the wrong place was a stoppage waiting to happen. The MG34's belts were faster to feed to a long post once a position was set, but belts and tins punished sloppiness. Links that had taken a set in a rattling box, a twist at the feed, an open tin left in dust. Quartermasters learned the differences before they ever fired a shot. Magazines were labor at the bench, belts were discipline on the march. The universal claim put the German gun in places the others did not travel as easily. The same receiver family rode in tanks and half-tracks and sat behind fortress embrasures without becoming a different model. In a Panzer, the armored variant shaved trench lips by coaxial burst so the main gun could work. In a hull, it kept alleys honest. In a coastal casemate, mounts and sight brackets designed around the receiver let fortress troops reopen pre-registered lanes by number even when smoke hid every landmark. Armies that built separate patterns for each role, light for the squad, heavy for the company, vehicle gun for the hull, lived with the logistics of 3 families. The German approach made one family carry the burden of excellence everywhere, and that burden showed up in the places you could not see. Gauge sets in workshops, spare barrels in sleeves, and a training curriculum that expected a corporal to think like a surveyor. Environment pressed the comparison further. In dust and cold, the Bren and DP earned their reputations for forgiveness. Their clearances and magazines tolerated neglect better. The MG34 insisted on the bargain it had always demanded. Belts laid straight, oil kept thin in cold and scarce in heat, bolt cycled by hand before loading to feel what steel had done overnight. In return, it gave back low lanes at ranges where lighter guns became punctuation rather than prose. On frozen mornings and in summer glare, crews learned that a little discipline beat a little luck. The enemy learned it too, in the way they moved, crawling longer, standing later, smoke screens heavier than they would have been against a lighter, less certain threat. Factory arithmetic cut in from another angle and explained procurement choices that soldiers felt but did not see. Highly machined receivers with tight fits and intricate feed covers made beautiful instruments. They also consumed machine hours and skilled hands that could not be conjured at scale. Rival designs built from stampings and welds could be delivered faster and in greater numbers with less experienced labor. Countries that planned for long industrial wars tended to simplify. Those that planned for measured, limited campaigns tolerated elegance longer. The MG34 began as a peacetime solution delivered into a total war. Its successor was a total war solution delivered before peacetime had a chance to argue back. Tactics absorbed those facts and reflected them on the ground. A German platoon's night routine summarized a decade of doctrine and thousands of inspection stamps. The machine gun posts were numbered, bearings and elevations written in a pocketbook, belts laced with a tracer at set intervals for daylight speech, heavy balls set aside for the long lanes, special rounds kept in a pouch for the job that needed them and not for the mood that wanted them. A British section's practice, just as disciplined, looked different. Magazines counted and topped up, spare parts checked, the tripod for the Vickers somewhere else entirely. A Soviet company's reality was its own mix. DP pans nested in crates, a wheeled heavy gun behind, and later an SG-43 replacing the weight and effort of the older Maxim with a belt-fed rhythm of its own. Each system worked because it was coherent. Each exposed its seams when ground and time refused to play along. In city fights, the comparisons acquired edges you could draw on a floor plan. A Bren at a window was quicker to shoulder through a doorway and steadier around a corner. A belt-fed gun made lanes across a street into laws rather than wishes. The tripod in the room upstairs created interlocking diagonals by number. The light downstairs flicked in and out by feel. Both mattered, and the side that married them to mortars and rifles and a squad leader's eye usually wrote the last lines on the map. When tanks nosed into those streets, the shared mechanisms inside German hulls kept coaxial and hull guns in the same vocabulary as the infantry next to them. In Allied vehicles, different receivers did the same jobs well enough, but the continuity mattered to the men who carried gauge sets and spares in the same boxes they had carried before. The psychological ledger, which veterans discussed only when pressed, favored the guns that stitched low and even at range. The fast pulse of newer receivers drew attention and fear in close, and there is no point pretending otherwise. But the quiet authority of a grazing line, the way it made men crawl for 20 minutes along a ditch they would otherwise have trotted in too, was the MG34's peculiar contribution. It was not spectacle, it was control, and control is what small units trade for time. After the war, when instructors in new uniforms briefed recruits on foreign weapons they might see again, the lesson was cautious and simple. Respect the belt-fed guns for the lanes they can hold. Expect them to punish carelessness and reward routine. Remember that a gun built to be many things is only ever as good as the crew that keeps its bargain in the dark. Clean belts, thin oil in cold, barrels changed on time, lanes set by number, not by hope. At other tables, procurement officers wrote the same idea with different pen strokes. Buy the simpler receiver for most jobs. Keep the precise one where mounts and method make its manners pay. All the contradictions of the MG34 live comfortably in one scene that soldiers from several armies would recognize. A squad moves at dawn to a wall that looks out over a track. The gunner lies behind a receiver that could be 50 different things and is, at this moment, just one. A bipod gun that will fire 2 short strings and then a third if the second does not sit right. The assistant feeds a belt without twist and feels the feed pawls bite through a glove. Upstairs, a tripod is set back from a window, its optic indexed to a tree and a telegraph pole. The traverse drum is already at 3 clicks right, 1 up. Somewhere else, a team with a light automatic waits to flick in and out around a corner, the way a cat's paw taps and vanishes. None of them will ever see the factory floor where a gauge punched a tiny stamp into a bolt face. All of them will live by what that stamp meant. A mechanism that kept its end of the bargain if they kept theirs. The weapon's legacy is not a single line of steel. It is the habit it insisted upon and the doctrine it made possible. Ground turned into numbers, minutes bought with belts, precision chosen over spectacle when it mattered. The post-war world bought and sold the receiver for years, then moved on to children that learned different compromises. Yet, wherever a careful crew takes a breath, sets a lane by a landmark, and treats a gun as an instrument rather than a noise, a little of that old bargain stands at their shoulder. The cost, the craft, and the control that made a universal machine gun more than a name stamped into a side plate. Demobilization turned battlefields into tables and crates. In barracks and ordnance schools, instructors laid the MG34 beside the guns it had fought against and alongside, and they wrote up what mattered now that the noise was gone. How it was built, how it was fed, how it was kept alive, and why its strengths had cost so much to field its scale. The same gestures crews had used in cellars and at hedgerows opened every bench review. Feed cover down until the spring bit cleanly. Bolt worked once by hand to feel for drag. Spare barrel sleeve checked to keep grit out. Because a weapon that had lived by routine was best judged by the routines it demanded. The ledgers that had pushed Germany toward simplification during the war were read again in peacetime. They did not condemn the MG34. They explained it. A milled receiver with tight clearances meant dozens of machining steps, careful heat treatment, and hours under gauges. A feed cover that walked a belt a half-step open and a half-step closed required spring temper held inside a narrow band. A quick-change barrel door that made sustained fire practical came with its own tail, mitts, sleeves, gauges, and the training hours that turned change into reflex before accuracy wandered. Each line item made sense on its own. Stacked together, they were a budget. Man-hours, inspector's time, transport space for tripods and optics, and live fire days to teach crews to match minutes to meters. Those same papers recorded what had happened when the arithmetic shifted mid-war. Where the MG34 carved and ground its way to precision, its simplified sister stamped and welded its way to numbers. Procurement officers could count the difference without firing a shot. In units, commanders had already learned it by ear. If you needed geometry, a measured grazing line at distance on a tripod, you kept the steadier cadence. If you needed raw volume to punish a hedge or wall at close range, the faster pulse earned its place. After 1945, the memos made that field solution durable. Keep the precise receiver where mounts and method made its manners pay. Buy the simpler build wherever throughput mattered most. The idea the MG34 had carried survived the procurement shift. Universal machine gun ceased to be a German ambition and became a template. One receiver, many mounts, light on a bipod for movement, sustained on a tripod for defense. A feed that accepted long belts without complaint. A squad taught to revolve around the machine gun's lane rather than around the rifleman's aim. These lessons outlived the factory codes on a side plate. When new armies wrote their manuals in new languages, the diagram looked familiar, even if the model number did not. West Germany returned to service with a general-purpose gun on a tripod whose traverse and elevation box let a corporal reopen last night's lane by number. Britain adopted a general-purpose gun of its own, pairing a steady receiver with a belt feed that owed something to the German solution and then made it their own. The United States fielded a different answer, but to the same question: one gun to ride vehicles and tripods and sling on a squad's shoulders. The Soviet answer traveled a parallel road. A belt-fed receiver light enough for a bipod, and honest on a tripod, fed from the top, driven by a long-stroke piston, different in mechanics, similar in purpose. Across the divide, the habit the MG34 had insisted on remained: turn ground into numbers, buy minutes with belts, treat the machine gun as the squad's center of gravity. Where old mounts survived, the MG34 itself endured. Vehicle interiors designed around its barrel jacket and cocking geometry did not forgive substitutions easily. Coaxial cradles and ball mounts took the armored variant without complaint, and for years after the ceasefire, answered to the same belts and spares that workshops already knew how to service. Fortress embrasures built around the receiver and its sight brackets stayed useful as long as ammunition matched. Border posts and police units, short on new equipment, kept tripods because the calm, single-shot control the double crescent trigger offered was exactly what a quiet lane demanded. In places where calibers shifted, workshops rebarreled and retimed feed covers when it could be done economically. Where calibers stayed the same, crates were simply opened and the old routines resumed. On the museum side of the line, the hidden cost persisted in miniature. Restorers who could make a dozen other receivers per in a weekend sometimes found the MG34 slow to forgive even careful hands. A bolthead's locking lugs that had worn unevenly during the war told their story under a thumbnail. A feed Powell spring that had taken a bad temper years ago announced itself in a cover that shut without the right bite. An optic that had once indexed a church spire at 800 meters needed new glass cut to old curvature if the traverse drum was to mean what it used to mean in a classroom. None of this was drama. It was the same bargain the gun had always offered: precision if you did your part, reluctance if you did not. Doctrine's quiet pieces, the ones that never made it into recruiting posters, proved the most durable. Range cards with grease pencil landmarks. Tracer laced through belts by rule rather than mood, so daylight bursts could speak. Left, lift, hold. Heavy ball reserved for tripod lanes across long fields. Special rounds kept for tasks, not for tempers. A corporal's notebook with bearings and clicks to reopen a lane at dawn when fog hid everything but the numbers. The weapon had taught these habits because it punished their absence. Post-war training kept them because they worked even when models changed and calibers shifted. Comparisons that had filled wartime reports remained useful when the new generation of guns took over. Magazine-fed lights were still quicker around corners and cheaper to keep. Belt-fed centers still owned distance with a steadiness that turned a strip of ground into a problem. The tripod's geometry remained the difference between hope and control in any defense that needed minutes as much as meters. Leaders who had learned to think in shoulders and lanes kept the old vocabulary after the names on the receivers changed. A few truths from the factory floor migrated into engineering practice. Designing for manufacture, what peacetime engineers began calling it, was the lesson stamped into every revised wartime drawing. Parts that demanded grinding and lapping held secrets under the gauge. Parts that tolerated stamping and spot welds met quotas under pressure. The MG34's elegance had been a statement of what could be done by craftsmen's metalwork at scale. Its successor's speed was a statement of what had to be done when wars were decided in tons per month. Modern receivers split the difference with better machine tools and better steels, but the choice never vanished. Precision and throughput pull on the same rope. The trick is to calculate where to stand. The technical ledgers closed with notes that soldiers would have recognized even if they never saw the pages. Belt discipline saves more guns than spare parts do. Heat controls accuracy long before it makes smoke. Change early and you keep your line. Oil is as much a weather problem as a lubricant. The wrong grade at the wrong hour is glue. A good feed cover tells the truth through a glove. A tripod is dead weight until the hour you have to draw a lane across a road and make it law. These are all small things. They are also the things that turn a design into a system. Culturally, the receiver lived on for reasons that had nothing to do with doctrine. It appeared in newsreels and films because its silhouette read as German, even when prop hands had to hide the details from the camera. It turned up on ranges because collectors wanted to feel the two-stage trigger that had been described to them in fragments by relatives. It sat on classroom tables because instructors found it useful to teach the difference between a fire hose and a metronome, between volume and control, between a tool that forgives and a tool that insists. In those settings, the gun could be honest without bravado. It had been a soldier's instrument. It remained a teacher's. In the end, the weapons story makes most sense if read as a set of choices that never stop repeating. Make a gun that is many things in one, or many guns each good at one thing. Spend hours under cutters to gain steadiness, or stamp and weld to be there in numbers. Build doctrine that revolves around a lane, or doctrine that revolves around movement and a quick voice. The MG34 stood clearly on one side of those pairs. It asked for clean belts, careful hands, and time, not just on the mill, but on the range and on the march. In return, it gave control out of proportion to its weight whenever someone had the will and the minutes to make its geometry matter. That is why, even after newer receivers took most of the work, the older one kept turning up wherever a lane had to be law. Behind an embrasure, inside a hull, on a tripod at the back of a room where a corporal with a notebook could still reopen last night's line by number in morning fog. The ceasefire did not erase that kind of value. It just made it easier to see the cost alongside the benefit, and to place the tool where the bargain still made sense. So, the MG34 passed into the long present, part hardware, part habit, part cautionary note in an engineer's margin. What it taught remains useful. That precision is not free. That control is worth paying for when time matters more than spectacle. That a small team with a metronome of fire and a notebook can bend ground to their plan for longer than anyone thinks. The model number fades, the method does not. And in rooms, ranges, and pages where men and women still learn how to make a lane behave, its old quiet rules continue to earn their place. Peacetime study rooms turned the gun team back into individuals with jobs that had names. Manuals sketched them as numbers, the way a map abstracts a village. Number 1, the gunner. Number 2, the assistant. Number 3, and number 4, the carriers of belts, spare barrels, and, when the platoon could afford it, the tripod. In training halls that smelled of oil and chalk, instructors rebuilt the sequence those numbers once performed by instinct. The MG34 had always looked like a single object. It had never worked that way. It was a small company in miniature, mechanism, method, and minutes. The gunner's ritual began before the feed cover ever shut. He checked the bolt by feel, not sight. Back and forward once to hear the spring and to feel, through gloved fingers, where the steel had stiffened in the cold or dragged because someone had oiled where they should have wiped. The assistant laid the first belt so the leading link sat square and the first bend was soft, then let his left palm rest lightly on the belt's back just ahead of the cover. A pressure light enough to guide, firm enough to stop a twist from telegraphing into the pawls. If the day would begin with movement, a short 50-round belt rode in its drum to keep grit out of the first feed. If the position was already chosen, tins opened and long belts came up in their segments to be linked end to end. Curtains measured in minutes rather than bursts. The spare barrel lived between them like a quiet clock. In lectures, heat was a graph. In the field, it announced itself in scent and color. Crews learned to change early, not heroically, before groups walked, before the first hint of cook-off crept in, swapping hot for cool, with a motion so rehearsed that the side door latch's snap was more felt than heard. The mitt, blackened and stiff from use, lived in a pocket so cold, would not crack it when it was needed most. The chamois-lined sleeve stayed shut until the second it had to open. Dust inside that sleeve was not a detail but a bet against the next 5 minutes of accuracy. Tripod work made the team feel larger than it was. On the Lafette, the gunner became a setter of numbers more than a taker of aim. The traverse and elevation box, gears, knobs, and a clamp that kept a promise turned landmarks into arithmetic. A corporal's notebook held a private topography. Poplar 640, culvert 780, 3 left, 1 up to sweep the ditch. An optic, when the unit had one, was memory as much as glass. Range drums were indexed to the ammunition on hand, and the reticle, a simple pattern learned until it lived at the back of the eye, made a hedgerow into a line of ticks. Reliefs met in fog at midnight and handed over not a target, but a plan. The lane set by number, the clicks to walk it, the moments to lift for a crossing. The ammunition carriers were not porters, they were the weapons calendar. They learned the rhythm of a post, the way an assistant gunner learned the taste of heat, how quickly a curtain consumed a 250-round box on the tripod. How long a bipod string could hold a lane without raising the muzzle, when to call for singles and when to accept the cost of 2 quick washes to buy a crossing. They also learned the quiet economies that manuals tucked into margins. Keep tracer laced by rules so daylight bursts can speak. Save heavy ball for the long lanes where its steadiness matters. Hold back the last 2 drums for movement or dust. Where keeping a first belt clean buys time, nobody can replace once it's gone. Tools that looked like afterthoughts in photographs were, in practice, the difference between a day that ran and one that broke. Belt loaders sat on tables like small presses, turning tins of loose cartridges into straight, obedient lengths of linked rounds. A cut-down brush in a pouch chased grit from feed teeth after every string. A short plank rode with the team in mud country to give a prone gun something firmer than churned clay. A scrap of cloth lived near the cover latch to wipe the feed path each time the gun fell silent. None of it was glamorous. All of it separated finicky from forgiving in the same steel. Lectures about the mechanism itself shifted in peacetime from legend to layout. Instructors drew the short recoil cycle on boards until the bolt's rotation made sense in 3 lines. Barrel and bolt back together a little. Cam path turns the head. Bolt continues alone. The point wasn't vocabulary, it was care. Strong primary extraction depends on that rotation being smooth and timed. A burr on a lug face becomes a stoppage weeks later. A cover spring with the wrong temper closes neatly but feeds grudgingly. Gauges told the truth no anecdote could. Headspace that slid in with the right feel. Lug faces that showed even faint burnishing under a thumbnail. A feed cover that shut with a bite you could feel through a glove. In war, these were a sergeant's superstitions. In peace, they were methods. Where vehicles remained in service, the armored variant explained why the receiver never truly retired. Coaxial cradles and ball mounts had been built around its jacket and geometry, the way it sat in a collar, the path of spent cases, the reach of a cocking handle behind armor. Inside a hull, the gun's jobs were blunt and constant. A coaxial burst shaved a trench lip so the main gun could work without seeing its own dust. A hull gun filled a blind arc in an alley where the turret could not watch. The continuity mattered for maintenance as much as tactics. Gauges were the same. Belts were belts. Spares from tins stamped with letter codes fit where they were supposed to. Universal meant something practical in steel. A receiver that changed cradles faster than doctrine could change mounts. The comparison classes, the ones where recruits learned foreign silhouettes by the curve of a magazine or the line of a barrel jacket, used the MG34 to teach differences that weren't about names at all. Magazine-fed lights, quick to shoulder through a doorway. Forgiving in neglect, asked less preparation and gave back less time on the lane. Belt-fed centers, fussier about belts and covers, asked more hands and gave back minutes instead of moments. The lesson wasn't better or worse. It was, what do you need here? If the answer was a long, low seam at 700 meters that a relief could reopen by number at dawn, the tripod and the steadier cadence were worth their weight. If the answer was a corner and a sprint, a lighter automatic made the room feel safer. The smart platoon married both and taught its leaders to recognize which problem they had before they raised a sight. Night drills preserved the parts of doctrine that were easiest to forget when the world brightened. Without landmarks, the traverse drum and the range card carried the load. Tracer became speech rather than spectacle, one round in a belt every so many, to talk rather than to point. Field telephones stitched posts when wire existed. When it didn't, the math did. The optics glass helped if the sky offered light. If it didn't, numbers won. A post that could be handed off in the dark because the relief could read a notebook and set a knob was the unit's real currency, minutes that didn't depend on weather or moon. Museums turned some of this into captions, but the people who kept the remaining guns alive had their own quiet catechism. Wipe the feed path each time you stop. Keep the spare barrel sleeve shut until your hand reaches for it. Oil like you mean it in the right place, and not at all in the wrong place. Cycle the bolt by hand at dawn. Feel for the spring bite when the cover shuts. These were not nostalgic gestures. They were how a metronome stays a metronome after a decade in a crate. Engineers who came later took other lessons, the kind that don't show up in photographs. Design for the factory as much as for the field. Decide which parts deserve tight fits and which can be stamped and spot welded without apology. Keep the ability to write geometry with a tripod and an optic even if the receiver changes. Leave room in the training calendar for hands to learn the difference between right and almost, because no drawing can tell a palm what a clean cycle feels like. The MG34 had been, in the strictest sense, over-engineered for the war it entered. It was also, in the broader sense, a proof that control is worth paying for when time matters more than spectacle. Post-war users who kept it did so for reasons that rarely made it into procurement briefs. A border post liked the way a single shot broke clean when a corporal pressed the upper face of the trigger. A coastal fort kept its old mounts because the brackets fit and the numbers on the drum still match the landmarks in a sector sketch. A training school put it on a table to make a point that lost its force if you only said it. A belt-fed receiver with a tripod can make ground behave like a chart. And once you've seen that happen, You think about lanes first and noise second. Everywhere it went after, the same quiet bargain held. Precision in exchange for attention. Geometry in exchange for weight. Minutes in exchange for hours. On mills, on benches, on ranges. The names on side plates changed, the calibers shifted, and the factories learned how to stamp what they once had to grind. The habit remained. A careful crew, a numbered lane, a first burst that sits where it should because someone wiped a feed path in the dark. That was the MG34's real afterlife. Not a serial line, but a way of working that refused to be hurried and rewarded anyone who refused to hurry it. Peacetime classrooms eventually turned drills into muscle memory, and that memory, more than any sight or spring, was what made a machine gun section function. The MG34 sat at the center of that section, not as an ornament, but as a job list everyone could perform in the dark. The gunner's hands on the pistol grip and traverse clamp, the assistant's palm guiding the belt, the carriers pacing the post like clocks with tins and spare barrels. Instructors broke the work into pieces until each piece was boring, then stitched it back together under a whistle so that boredom became speed. Fire control began with words that turned into motions. Traverse, search, graze, lift. A traverse shifted the lane in small equal bites left or right. A search walked the same lane up or down a slope in measured elevation. Grazing fire meant knee-high at distance. Plunging meant arcs that fell into dips and gullies where an enemy might think he was safe. Leaders taught the geometry first on paper, then by touch on the Lafette's traverse and elevation box. 3 clicks right, 1 up, hold 2 beats, repeat. A good post felt like a metronome. 2 tripod guns, offset, made a lattice. Interlocking curtains the platoon could describe with a pencil at noon and reopen in fog at dawn. Positions were chosen to make that math cruel. Defilade, firing along, not into, a front, was prized. A lane raked a path rather than facing it. Backs of ditches were stitched rather than their lips. A road's camber was used like a rail to keep fire at the right height. Aiming stakes or quiet landmarks, a pale stone, a stump, became range marks on pocket cards. Stump 620, hedge 840, 3 left to reach the culvert. Alternate and supplementary positions existed before they were needed. Tripods wore the ground under them before the hour came. The bipod gun's place was closer, window sills, the low shoulder of a lane, the recess of a wall, where short strings could hold a corner while a squad slid or fell back. Barrel management lived inside every plan. Heat didn't announce itself with a fanfare. It arrived as a smell and a color shift at the muzzle and the faint opening of groups. Crews counted in habit. Roughly so many rounds for the bipod, fewer for the tripod where single shots and clipped bursts did most of the work, and changed early. The assistant gunner did not wait to be told. The mitt came out. The side door clacked. The spare came from a sleeve kept shut against grit until that second. Barrels were treated as a rotation, not as heroes. The one that had cooled went to the bottom of the stack. The one that had just come out cooled mouth down where dust wouldn't seed the bore. Cleaning meant brass brush and pull-through at the first calm minute, not at the end of the day when the day might never end. Belts were language. Short 50-round lengths lived in drums to keep the first rush clean on dusty ground or through rubble. Long linked segments fed positions once the post was set. Tins open, belts joined, starter tab ready, so the first pull was positive. Tracer was laced by rule rather than whim, so daylight bursts could speak to neighboring posts. Left, lift, hold, without a telephone. Heavy bore was reserved for the lanes that reached far. Special rounds were kept for jobs that needed them, and not for moods. A belt with mixed purpose was a sentence with punctuation. A belt loaded at random was a shout that helped no one. Malfunctions were treated like weather, expected, prepared for, and robbed of drama by routine. A feed hesitation meant a palm smoothing the belt, then a cover lifted and shut. No rush, just the pal's bite confirmed, and the bolt cycled once by hand. A stubborn case got the combination tool and a beat's patience. A true runaway, a rare failure where the gun continued firing, had its own practiced cure. Twist and break the belt, hold the gun low, ride the weapon through until empty. The difference between a scary story and a solved problem was seconds, and those seconds came from drills done with empty belts and a sergeant's watch out of sight. Maintenance, the daily tax for precision, settled into small, repeatable gestures. Oil was thin and cold, scarce in heat. The feed path was wiped with a scrap of cloth whenever the gun fell quiet. A cut-down brush chased grit from the feed teeth. The bolt was cycled by hand at first light to feel through the handle whether steel had stiffened overnight. Spare parts that mattered most, extractors, firing pins, springs, lived in a pouch with the gauges that told the truth. Headspace feel, lug faces that showed even faint burnishing, a feed cover that shut with the right spring bite even through a glove. The Lafette turned the receiver into an instrument and the team into a survey crew. The traverse clamp behaved like a promise. The elevation drum turned range into clicks that any relief could read. Instructors taught crews to set final protective lines, the last resort seam along a ditch or terrace, by number, and to mark the drum so that in darkness a new team could open the lane without seeing the ground. With 2 posts, the lines crossed. With 3, a wedge of space became hostile at a gesture. An optic, when issued, was glass and memory both. When it wasn't, the drum and the card did the same work in simpler form. Anti-aircraft drill kept a corner of the team's mind honest. Ring and post sights came out as needed. Lead was estimated by experience and the speed of the target. Belts were rationed because skyward fire spent cartridges that might decide a lane on the ground at noon. The purpose was modest: harass, spoil an approach, make a pilot climb or veer. The arithmetic was harsh. Every belt to the sky was a belt not on the tripod. Leaders weighed it on the moment's merits and put the drum back on the post when the moment passed. Inside vehicles, the same receiver family wore different furniture and did familiar work. In a gunner's hands, a short coaxial burst shaved a trench lip so the main gun could see. A hull gun covered a blind arc that a turret could not watch. The continuity mattered. Gauges were the same. Belts were belts. Spares from tins stamped with acceptance marks fit where they should without persuasion. Crews who had learned on the infantry pattern recognized the armored variant by feel, the same bolt stroke, the same truth told by a feed cover that shut with a clean bite. Coordination with mortars and rifles made the machine gun more than itself. Range cards included marks where a platoon's light mortars could walk smoke or high explosive through a lane the tripod set. Tracer spoke to riflemen as much as to neighboring guns. A short, bright seam meant here now. A raised burst meant lift. A gap meant cross. Field telephones stitched posts while wire lasted. When it didn't, the pocket card and the clock carried the idea from one pair of hands to the next. Night work stripped comfort and left only method. Landmarks vanished. Numbers remained. A relief climbed a stair, traded a notebook, felt the traverse drum setting with a fingertip, and reopened a lane into fog because someone had measured it 12 hours earlier. Single shots corrected in darkness. Short strings enforced the seam. The assistant gunner counted heartbeats the way he counted rounds. The tripod's weight, cursed on the march, paid back in minutes when minutes were all there was to trade. Live fire exercises made those abstractions visible. A platoon established a pair of interlocking posts on a gentle slope. The bipod gun took a corner in a shallow fold 30 meters forward. At the whistle, the tripod guns announced their lanes with short, even bursts that sat where the cards said they would sit. The bipod gun spoke in clipped strings to hold a culvert while a stick crossed. A barrel changed on count rather than crisis. A belt went in with a smooth hand and a starter tab, a feed cover shut with a spring's good bite. When the whistle blew again, the posts lifted 2 clicks and searched the slope in steps, then returned to the original grazing line without a word. The geometry held because the habits held. The section's spare kit looked unremarkable on a table and indispensable in the field. A belt loader that turned tins into obedient lengths of linked cartridges. A combination tool that did a dozen small jobs. Brushes and pull-throughs. A short plank for mud country. A pouch with gauges and the few small parts that mattered most. None of it drew a camera. All of it made the difference between finicky and forgiving when the day went long. What the MG34 imposed, above all, was a style. Treat fire like a plan, not a noise. It rewarded small economies, change barrels early, wipe the feed path, lace tracer by rule, because those economies bought time and kept lines straight. It punished carelessness fast and publicly. The lesson outlived the serial number. Later receivers with different furniture and factories kept the mathematics of lanes and the language of belts because they worked in any language. Turn ground into numbers, buy minutes with control, make a strip of earth behave like a chart. Instructors who had learned their trade the hard way kept the tone plain. A careful crew beats a clever one that hurries. A clean belt beats a brave plan. A lane written in a notebook beats a landmark you hope to recognize in smoke. And the first burst, short, low, exactly where it should be, decides whether the next 5 minutes are yours or someone else's. The MG34 had taught all of that by insisting on it. Long after, in rooms and ranges far from its factories, those quiet rules remained the part worth remembering. Armorers' benches told a quieter history of the gun than any after-action report. A receiver arrived with its finish dulled by cosmoline. The first inspection was by fingertips more than by eyes. Headspace gauges slid in with the right feel, or they didn't. The locking lugs showed a faint, even burnish, or they told on a cutter that had gone dull months earlier. A feed cover closed with a spring-clean bite, or it hinted at a temper that would slacken under heat. In classrooms, these were points on a checklist. On a bench, they were the fingerprints of factories, subcontractors, and a logistics system that tried to keep a promise under bombardment. Marking said what paperwork no longer could. Names gave way to letter codes as the war deepened. Tidy stampings with year marks were replaced by smaller, faster proofs. Acceptance eagles and tiny numbers clustered near the barrel jacket and feed cover hinge, each one a breadcrumb from jig to jig. Armorers learned to read them like railway clerks read timetables, less for romance than for lead time. Certain clusters meant spare parts would fit without a file. Others meant the gauges stayed out longer and the parts bin came closer. It was the same receiver and the same doctrine, but the administration of precision had to travel in secret across a continent. Production changes showed up first where hands met steel. Early guns wore deep polish and bluing. Edges felt soft under a cloth. As the calendar turned, machining marks grew more visible, Small parts that had been milled arrived as pressings, and finishes became workmanlike rather than handsome. The feed cover remained a little watch under a lid, but springs came from different furnaces, and inspectors learned to reject by feel. The quick change barrel door still latched with a confident snap, but the sleeves that carried spares lost their niceties and kept their necessity. None of this altered what the gun did. It altered how much attention it demanded for the same result. Tripods carried their own genealogy. The Lafette, with its traverse and elevation gears, the instrument that turned a corporal into a surveyor, evolved in small, sensible steps. Casting simplified, clamps changed profile. Sight brackets accepted whatever optic the depot had on hand. Backward compatibility was an obsession in metal. A post could be relieved at midnight by a crew from another company, and the numbers on its drum would still mean the same arc across the ditch at dawn. In forts and coastal works, fixed mounts were the quiet cousins. Thick collars that mated to a barrel jacket profile. Sight blocks that assumed a certain optic. Base plates poured into concrete years before anyone knew who would sit behind them. Continuity kept those posts useful long after maps changed. Optics kept two traditions alive at once, glass as memory, and numbers as insurance. On good days, the periscopic sight or the low-power optic gave a clean reticle on a hedge or a berm. And the traverse drum turned thought into law. 3 clicks right, 1 up, hold. On bad days, cracked glass or missing cases put the burden back on the notebook. Range drums, calibrated for standard ball, were indexed to landmarks that did not move. A relief that could set a lane by number without seeing the ground was worth more than any promise on a requisition. Allied intelligence catalogued the same truths from the other side of the table. Captured weapons pamphlets praised the steadiness of tripod fire and the control a 2-stage trigger gave to a trained hand. They noted the costs. Belts punished sloppiness. Tight fits punished neglect. A gun designed to be universal still required a small company's worth of kit. Tripod, optics, spare barrels, tins, if a unit wanted the geometry as well as the noise. Those pamphlets made their way back into training halls where recruits learned to tell silhouettes apart, and, more importantly, to decide when a belt-fed post was the problem to solve first. Not every lesson lived in a manual. Quartermasters drew their own maps as the war lengthened. Railheads that could still deliver heavy ball for long lanes. Depots that stocked the correct belt segments rather than odd lots. Workshops where inspector stamps tended to mean what they should. The gun's reputation for exacting care either grew or withered along those routes. Where belts arrived straight and dry and spare barrels came with sleeves unpunctured by grit, a platoon could keep its lanes like lines on paper. Where tins rattled and a single gauge made the rounds for 2 companies, finicky became a curse word that really meant we need time we don't have. Misunderstandings followed the sound more than the steel. Memory loved spectacle, and many veterans, and more filmmakers, assigned the fast, tearing pulse of the newer receiver to every belt-fed silhouette they saw. Crews who had lived behind the steadier cadence shrugged and let the confusion stand. What mattered to them was the lane, low, even, discouraging at distance. The way a tripod post could make 100 meters of track feel like a law. The clean break of a single shot when the upper face of a double crescent was pressed to correct a stitch without wasting a belt. Sound was theater. Control was the plot. Post-war custodianship gave the mechanism a second calling. Museums wanted one exemplar to show craft. Training schools wanted a working receiver to show method. The same small items became rare for both. A feed cover with springs that still had their temper. An optic with glass that could be brought back to clarity, a traverse drum whose numbers matched its motion. Restorers learned the armorer's old rules in the present tense. Oil where it belongs, not where it's convenient. Wipe first, then judge. Trust gauges more than reputation. The gun had been built as an argument for attention. It made the same argument to anyone who tried to bring it back to life for a classroom. Doctrine's migration into new metals showed what had been essential and what had been incidental. General-purpose guns that came after chose stampings and spot welds by default, ran on different gas systems or lockups, and ate different cartridges. Yet the tripod's geometry survived intact. The expectation that a corporal could reopen last night's lane at dawn by number. The habit of lacing tracer as language. The discipline of changing barrels early because dispersion is a physics problem, not a mood. The MG34 had been a peacetime idea dressed for total war. Its children were wartime ideas trimmed for peacetime planning. The method threaded through both. Training syllabi settled into a cadence that would have looked familiar to a recruit in 1938. Roles first, gunner, assistant, carriers. Words into motions, traverse, search, graze. Maintenance without romance. Wipe the feed path. Cycle the bolt by hand at first light. Keep the spare barrel sleeve shut until it has to open. Live fire made the abstractions honest. Interlocking lanes on a slope. A bipod post guarding a culvert. A barrel change on count rather than in crisis. A relief that could inherit numbers in fog and reopen a scene without seeing more than a tree and a pole. Supply and inspection stayed the quiet determinants. A section with a belt loader that worked, tins that kept out rain, and a small pouch of spares, extractors, pins, springs, lived more comfortably than a section with the same courage and none of the kit. An armorer who read acceptance stamps as a language, not a decoration, could keep guns in families that shared tolerances and temper. The riflemen who learned to watch the machine gun lane as a fact rather than as a rumor moved differently across a field. None of this required new theory. It required the patience to turn small certainties into control. If there is a clean way to sum the armorer's chapter of the story, it is this. Precision is a culture before it is a part. The MG34 enforced that culture, on benches, in depots, on ranges, and at posts where a numbered drum mattered more than a shouted order. Its hidden costs were never only in rice marks or minutes under a cutter. They were in habits, belts laid straight, glass kept clear, notebooks filled before dusk, barrels changed before groups wandered, the click of a feed cover judged through a glove. Those habits outlived the gun's contracts because armies that liked control more than spectacle kept them even when the serial line changed. In that sense, the receiver's long afterlife is less about the artifact than about the posture it taught. Treat fire as a plan. Make ground obey numbers. Accept the weight that buys minutes. Whether the side plate reads an old code or a new name, the crew that works that way is doing what generations of gunners did when they leaned into a tripod leg. Set a traverse drum by a note in a book, and sent the first burst short and low to tell the ground exactly how the next 5 minutes would go.